The morning sun painted the Wyoming mountains in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the valley floor, where Elias McCord's cabin stood like a sentinel against the wilderness. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, carrying the scent of pine and coffee into the crisp autumn air. At 37, Elias moved with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to negotiate the harshest terrain on instinct, alone his buckskin clothing worn soft from years of use against wind and rock. He placed a weathered tin cup on the porch railing and studied the horizon with eyes the color of mountain slate. 7 years had passed since he'd buried Sarah beneath the towering ponderosa 50 yards from where he now stood, and still each morning began the same way: coffee at dawn, then a quiet visit to her grave before the day's work began. The wooden cross he'd carved with his own hands had weathered over the years, the edges softened by rain and snow and time. But the pain remained as sharp as ever, a constant companion that had driven him deeper into the mountains and further from the memories of their life together. "Another day, Sarah," he murmured, kneeling beside the grave. The rituals of grief had become as natural as breathing, speaking to her about small things: the weather, the tracks he'd found near the creek, the eagle that had nested in the tall pine on the north ridge. Today, though, something felt different. A restlessness hummed in his blood and an awareness of change coming that he couldn't name but could sense as surely as he could track deer through fresh snow. He'd learned to trust these feelings during his decade in the high country. Nature spoke to those who knew how to listen, and Elias had been listening for a very long time. Rising, he returned to the cabin. The interior reflected the man who inhabited it, Spartan but meticulously organized. Shelves lined with books, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect against moisture, tools hung, according to use, a bed built with his own hands. Everything necessary for survival, nothing more. The silence of the place wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. But today, that silence felt like a weight. His coffee supplies had run out 3 days ago, and ammunition was running low. Doc Peterson had also sent word about a sick horse at the Weatherby Ranch that needed attention. Elias had a way with animals that the doctor respected, and he never ignored a request for help, even if it meant venturing down to Cedar Ridge and the complications of human society. With practiced efficiency, he gathered what he needed for the journey: his Colt revolver hunting knife and a small carved wooden horse he'd made during the long winter evenings. It was intended for little Sarah Wickham, the youngest student at the schoolhouse, who had shown him kindness on his rare visits to town. Her gap-toothed smile was one of the few human interactions he genuinely looked forward to. Patience, his sturdy mountain mare, nickered softly as he approached the corral. She'd been his only true companion for the past 5 years, and she seemed to understand his moods better than any person ever had. Her intelligent eyes watched as he saddled her, the leather creaking in the morning quiet. "Long ride today, old girl," he said, running a hand along her neck. "Down to the world of people and their troubles." The trail down from his cabin followed game paths and abandoned mining roads winding through aspen groves whose leaves had begun to turn gold with the approaching fall. Elias rode with the relaxed vigilance of a man who knew the wilderness held dangers but considered them far more honest than those found in towns and cities. Cedar Ridge appeared in the valley below, a collection of weathered buildings that seemed impossibly small against the vastness of the landscape. From this distance, Elias could see the main street with its handful of establishments: the general store, the saloon, the blacksmith shop, and the church with its modest steeple. And something new: a figure in a blue dress sweeping the steps of the schoolhouse, her movements graceful and deliberate. Even from a distance, he could tell she didn't belong here. She carried herself differently, like someone who had spent her life in gentler surroundings. A new schoolteacher, most likely. They came and went with the seasons, rarely lasting through their first Wyoming winter, before fleeing back east to comfort and civilization. He nudged Patience forward, descending the last slope toward town. The sounds of human activity grew louder: the blacksmiths hammered children's voices, the creak of wagon wheels on the rutted main street. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always accompanied these journeys into society. 7 years hadn't been enough to dull the discomfort of being among people after finding peace in solitude. Martha Henley spotted him first as he approached the general store. She was hanging laundry behind the building, her capable hands quick with clothespins despite her advancing years. "Elias McCord, as I live and breathe," she called, wiping her hands on her apron. "Haven't seen you since spring thaw. You're looking thin. Are you eating properly up there in those mountains?" "I manage fine, Mrs. Henley." His voice carried the rusty quality of a man who spoke mainly to horses and the occasional hawk. "Need some supplies. Coffee, ammunition, salt." "Come inside then. Jim just brought in fresh stock." She studied him with the assessing eye of a woman who had raised 6 children and buried 3. "You should know we have a new school teacher. Miss Clara Davenport came in from Boston yesterday. Educated woman, very proper. She'll be teaching our young ones to read and cipher." Elias nodded politely, though he had little interest in the comings and goings of townsfolk. His business was with the wilderness, not with proper ladies from back east who'd likely be on the next stagecoach home once winter set in. The interior of the general store was dim after the bright sunlight outside. Jim Henley, Martha's husband of 30 years, nodded a greeting from behind the counter where he was measuring flour into cloth sacks. "Elias, supplies as usual." "Yes, and a bit of peppermint candy for Sarah Wickham if you have it." Jim smiled. "Always thinking of that little one, aren't you? Got some fresh in last week. I'll add it to your order." As Martha gathered his supplies, Sheriff Tom Bradley entered his badge, catching the afternoon light. A good man in his 50s who'd kept the peace in Cedar Ridge for 15 years, Tom had always treated Elias with respect, understanding that some men needed distance from civilization to heal whatever wounds they carried. "Elias," he nodded. "Glad you're here. Been meaning to talk to you. We've had some trouble lately. Cattle going missing from the ranches north of town. Professional job, not just rustlers looking for beef. Someone's organized moving herds at night, covering their tracks." Elias considered this as he paid for his supplies. "You think they'll bring their business to town?" "Maybe. Would be good to know you're keeping your eyes open up in the high country. See anything unusual, I'd appreciate hearing about it." Organized cattle thieves meant men with experience and planning, the kind who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses or obstacles. That made them dangerous to everyone in the territory, including proper school teachers who didn't understand how quickly civilized behavior could disappear when money and desperation were involved. "I'll keep watch," Elias promised. "Heading to Weatherby's now. Doc asked me to look at a sick horse." "Appreciate it." Tom's weathered face showed genuine gratitude. "And Elias might be good to stop by more often for a while, just until we know what we're dealing with." The unspoken message was clear. The sheriff valued Elias's skills even if the mountain man preferred to keep his distance. Whatever was coming, Cedar Ridge might need every capable hand available. As Elias loaded his supplies into saddlebags, a flash of blue caught his eye. The new teacher was walking toward the store, a small leather-bound book clutched to her chest, her posture straight as a pine sapling. Up close, he could see she was older than he'd initially thought, perhaps late 20s, with an intelligent face and eyes that noticed details. Those eyes widened slightly as she saw him taking in his buckskins and the long knife at his belt. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice carrying the refined tones of Eastern education. Elias nodded, uncomfortable with direct conversation. "Ma'am, you must be Mr. McCord. Mrs. Henley mentioned you live in the mountains. I'm Clara Davenport, the new teacher. Welcome to Cedar Ridge." The words felt stiff on his tongue, unpracticed. She smiled, revealing a warmth that surprised him. "Thank you. It's quite different from Boston, but I'm finding it has its own beauty." She glanced at Patience, admiration evident in her expression. "What a magnificent horse. She knows the mountains better than most men." His hand automatically reached out to stroke the mare's neck. "Been with me 5 years now. She looks very intelligent. I've always believed animals understand more than we give them credit for." Her observation was unexpected, showing a perception that went beyond city sensibilities. Before Elias could respond, Martha emerged from the store with the last of his supplies. "Miss Davenport, I see you've met our mountain man. Elias doesn't come to town often, so this is quite the occasion." Clara's eyes met his briefly, and Elias was struck by their clarity, green as spring aspen leaves. There was something in her gaze that spoke of determination and perhaps secrets of her own. Then she turned to Martha and the moment passed. "I've come to inquire about books for the school. The previous teacher seems to have taken most of the readers with him." As the women began discussing school supplies, Elias mounted Patience and turned toward the Weatherby ranch. The encounter had unsettled him in ways he couldn't define. There was something about Clara Davenport that didn't fit his preconceptions of Eastern ladies, a resilience beneath the propriety that suggested she might be more suited to frontier life than appearances suggested. But it wasn't his concern. His life was in the high country among the pines and eagles in honest silence. Whatever brought Clara Davenport to Wyoming was her business, just as his reasons for retreating from the world remained his own. Still, as he rode away from Cedar Ridge, the image of green eyes and quiet determination stayed with him, a ripple in the still pond of his solitude. Clara Davenport had felt every mile of the 3-day journey from Cheyenne to Cedar Ridge in her bones. The stagecoach had lurched and bounced over terrain that seemed determined to rattle her teeth loose, and her silk gloves, once pristine white, a gift from her mother for her 25th birthday, were now stained with dust and perspiration. Standing on the boardwalk of her new home, she smoothed her blue traveling dress and tried to compose herself. The leather satchel in her hand contained everything that mattered, from her old life letters of recommendation, a daguerreotype of her parents, and the ivory cameo brooch that had belonged to her grandmother. But those silk gloves represented something more profound: the refined world she was leaving behind, and the uncertain future she was walking toward. Cedar Ridge wasn't much to look at, a main street lined with weathered wooden buildings, their paint peeling under the relentless prairie sun. The general store, saloon, church, and blacksmith shop clustered together like old friends sharing secrets. Dust devils danced between the buildings, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed in the morning heat. This was a far cry from the cobblestone streets of Boston, where she'd spent her 29 years learning to be a proper lady. But propriety, she had discovered, was a cage as surely as any made of iron bars. "Miss Davenport, I presume?" A weathered woman in calico approached, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "I'm Martha Henley, own the general store with my husband. Been expecting you." Clara managed a smile. "Thank you for meeting me, Mrs. Henley. I confess the journey was more arduous than I anticipated." Martha's laugh was warm and genuine. "Child, you'll toughen up quick out here, or the frontier will eat you alive. But don't worry, we've all been greenhorns once. Even those of us born to it had to learn the hard way." She gestured toward a modest building at the end of the street. "That's your schoolhouse there. Living quarters are upstairs. Nothing fancy, but it's clean, and the roof don't leak much." As they walked, Martha pointed out the important landmarks. "That's Sheriff Bradley's office. He's a good man, keeps the peace when he can. The church there, Pastor Williams, holds service every Sunday and Wednesday. And that's the saloon. I'd avoid it if I were you, especially on Saturday nights when the cowboys come in from the ranches." Clara nodded, absorbing every detail. The school building was smaller than she'd expected, with 6 windows facing the street and a bell tower that had seen better days. Inside, wooden desks sat in neat rows, and a slate blackboard dominated the front wall. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the air. "Previous teacher left sudden like," Martha explained, climbing the narrow stairs to the living quarters. "Her husband got offered work in California, left us in quite a bind with 14 children needing schooling." The apartment was sparse but clean: a bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and a wood-burning stove. A wash basin sat on a stand near the single window, which offered a view of the mountains rising like ancient guardians beyond the town. Clara set down her satchel and pulled off her gloves, flexing fingers stiff from gripping them too tightly during the journey. "Why did you come west, dear?" Martha asked gently. "If you don't mind my asking." "Most educated women stay back east where life's easier." Clara was quiet for a moment, watching the mountains through the window. "Sometimes staying in familiar places can be the hardest thing of all, Mrs. Henley. I needed to discover what I was truly capable of away from expectations that weren't my own." Martha nodded knowingly. "Ah, man trouble then." "You could say that." Clara's voice carried the weight of unspoken disappointments. "I was engaged to a banker's son. A good match, everyone said. Secure future, proper social standing." She paused, running her fingers along the windowsill. "But I realized I was becoming someone I didn't recognize, living a life that felt like wearing someone else's clothes. And so you answered our advertisement for a teacher." "I did, though I confess I may have underestimated what frontier life would demand of me." Martha patted her shoulder. "We all did, honey, every last one of us." After Martha left, Clara unpacked her meager belongings. Among them was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with her neat, precise handwriting. She opened it to the first blank page and recorded the date September 15th, 1875. I have arrived in Cedar Ridge, Wyoming territory. The journey was exhausting but mercifully uneventful. My accommodations are simple but adequate. The people seem kind, if somewhat curious about my presence. Mrs. Henley, who runs the general store, has been particularly welcoming. Tomorrow, I will meet my students. 14 children of varying ages and backgrounds. I wonder what they will make of their new teacher from Boston. Will they see beyond the silk gloves and Eastern accent to the person I am trying to become? I saw a man today, a mountain man, Mrs. Henley called him, Elias McCord. He looked as wild and untamed as the landscape itself, yet there was a quietness about him that spoke of deep waters. His eyes reminded me of the slate roofs in Boston after rain, gray and watchful. He seems as out of place in town as I must appear to the locals. Tonight I will prepare my lessons and try to sleep despite the strange sounds of this frontier town. The vastness of the sky here is both terrifying and exhilarating. I feel both insignificant and somehow more real than I ever did in Boston's drawing rooms. Perhaps here at the edge of civilization, I can finally discover who Clara Davenport truly is, beyond the daughter, the fiancée, the proper Boston lady. Perhaps here I can find my own voice. She closed the journal and tucked it beneath her mattress. Its contents were for her eyes alone, her private thoughts and observations, and more importantly, the beginning of what she hoped would someday become a book about the women of the frontier. Not the sanitized stories that Eastern publishers preferred, but the raw truth of female experience in this harsh, beautiful land. The idea had come to her during the journey west as she listened to the stories of women on the stagecoach. A young bride heading to meet a husband she'd only seen in photographs, a widow traveling to live with her son on a cattle ranch, a former dance hall girl seeking a fresh start. Their stories had fascinated her, so different from the constrained narratives of proper Boston society. Clara touched the cameo brooch pinned to her collar, the smooth ivory cool against her fingertips. Her grandmother had worn it every day of her married life, a symbol of her station and respectability. But she had also been a woman of secret passions, poetry written in journals, hidden beneath floorboards, discovered only after her death. Clara wondered what her grandmother would think of her, now casting aside security for uncertainty, propriety for possibility. The next morning, Clara rose before dawn. She dressed carefully in a gray wool dress suitable for teaching, pinned her hair in a simple but neat style, and made her way downstairs to prepare the classroom. The building felt different in the early morning light, full of potential and purpose rather than emptiness. She wrote her name on the blackboard in her best handwriting, Miss Davenport. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added beneath it, "Welcome, students." By 8 o'clock, children began arriving, their faces curious and sometimes wary as they evaluated their new teacher. They ranged in age from 6 to 14, wearing clothes that spoke of practical frontier life, homespun shirts and dresses, sturdy boots, sun-browned skin that told of days spent outdoors. "Good morning," Clara said when all 14 seats were filled. "I am Miss Davenport, and I will be your teacher. I've come from Boston to help you learn reading, writing, arithmetic, and history. But I suspect you all have many things to teach me as well about life here in Wyoming territory." A small girl in the front row raised her hand tentatively. Her dress was carefully mended but clean, and she was missing her 2 front teeth. "Yes," Clara smiled encouragingly. "I'm Sarah Wickham, Miss Davenport. Do you have Indians in Boston?" The question startled a laugh from Clara. "No, Sarah. There are no Indian tribes living in Boston now, though there were many before the city was built." "Have you ever seen a bear?" This from a sturdy boy of about 10, "Only in a zoological garden, which is like a collection of animals from around the world. But they were in cages, not wild like the bears in your mountains." "My pa shot a bear last fall," the boy announced proudly, "said it was big as a wagon." "That must have been quite impressive," Clara acknowledged. "Now shall we begin our lessons? I'd like each of you to tell me your name and one thing you hope to learn this year." As the children introduced themselves, Clara made mental notes about each one. Tommy Patterson, the boy who'd mentioned the bear, wanted to learn enough numbers to help Pa with the cattle. His sister Mary, 2 years older, hoped to learn about medicines and doctoring. Little Sarah Wickham wanted to read stories about princesses and adventures. By noon, Clara had begun to form a picture of Cedar Ridge through the lens of its children. The town existed primarily to support the surrounding ranches with cattle as its economic foundation. Most families struggled against the elements, against cattle, thieves against the isolation of frontier life. Education was viewed as practical rather than enlightenings, a means to manage a ranch keep, accounts, read, contracts, and the Bible. But there was also a hunger for something more. She saw it in Mary Patterson's eyes when they discussed basic anatomy, in the way Tommy lingered over a map of the United States tracing routes to places he'd never seen. Even little Sarah, with her love of princesses, was reaching for a world beyond the harsh realities of Wyoming territory. During the lunch break, Clara walked to the general store to inquire about books. Martha Henley greeted her warmly, introducing her to Jim, whose calloused hands and kind eyes spoke of a lifetime of honest work. "We can order readers from Cheyenne," Jim offered. "Take a few weeks to arrive, but the stage brings mail in small packages regular." "That would be wonderful," Clara said. "In the meantime, I'll make do with what we have." The children seem eager to learn. "They're good kids," Martha affirmed. "Been through a lot, some of them. The Wickham girls lost their father last winter. Pneumonia took him quick. Tommy and Mary Patterson's family struggles, since their Emma had the baby 6 children now, and barely enough to feed them all." Clara nodded, filing away these details for her journal. The realities of frontier life were harsh, but the resilience of these families was remarkable. It was precisely this spirit she hoped to capture in her writing someday. As she was leaving the store, she spotted the mountain man again, Elias McCord. He was emerging from the livery stable, his movements fluid and economical. Something about him drew her attention, perhaps the contrast between his evident capability and his discomfort in town. He reminded her of a wolf she'd once seen in a menagerie, powerful, alert, and fundamentally unsuited to captivity. Their eyes met briefly across the street, and Clara felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. He nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement, then mounted his horse and rode toward the north end of town. "That's Elias," Martha said, appearing at Clara's elbow. "Been living up in the high country since his wife died. 7 years now, I think. Comes to town only when he needs supplies or when Doc Peterson asks for his help with animals. Has a way with them that Doc says is almost magical." His wife, Clara found herself curious despite her intention to focus on the women of Cedar Ridge. Sarah, lovely girl, mountain-born and raised, died in a blizzard while Elias was checking trap lines. He found her frozen in their cabin and hasn't been the same since. Folks say grief drove him into the wilderness. Martha sighed. Shame too. He was a different man before, still quiet, but with a light in his eyes that's gone now. Clara watched as Elias disappeared from view, his straight back and broad shoulders silhouetted against the afternoon sun. What must it be like to lose someone so completely, to have the center of your world torn away in a single night of snow and wind? The thought made her shiver despite the warm day. That evening, after the children had gone home and she prepared lessons for the following day, Clara added to her journal, "The children of Cedar Ridge are a revelation, resilient, curious, and far more aware of life's harshness than any child in Boston would be. They accept death and hardship as natural parts of existence." Little Sarah Wickham spoke matter-of-factly about her father's death last winter, then immediately asked if I could teach her to make paper dolls. Such transitions would be unthinkable in proper society. I've learned more about the mountain man, Elias McCord. His story is tragically romantic, the grieving widower retreating from the world after his beloved's death. But I suspect the reality is more complex. There is something in his bearing that speaks of deeper wounds, perhaps, from before his wife's passing. Mrs. Henley mentioned he has a way with animals that is almost supernatural. I wonder what other gifts he possesses hidden beneath that quiet exterior. The women here fascinate me. Martha Henley runs the general store alongside her husband as a true partner, not merely a helpmate. The ranch wives ride and shoot as well as any man. Even the children seem less confined by traditional roles. Mary Patterson dreams of becoming a doctor, and no one has told her such ambitions are unladylike. Perhaps this is what drew me west, not just escape from a suffocating engagement, but the promise of a place where a woman might define herself beyond society's narrow expectations, where I might finally discover what Clara Davenport is capable of becoming. She closed the journal, hiding it away in its usual place. Tomorrow she would begin interviewing the women of Cedar Ridge, recording their stories for her secret project. But tonight, as she prepared for sleep, her thoughts kept returning to gray eyes and the silent language of grief. The following week settled into a rhythm for Clara. Mornings were devoted to teaching, afternoons to preparation, and occasional visits to the homes of her students. In the evenings, she wrote in her journal, recording her observations of frontier life and the women who shaped it. She'd begun her interviews carefully, starting with Martha Henley, whose forthright manner made her an ideal first subject. They sat in the Henleys' kitchen after the store had closed, drinking tea as Martha described her journey west 30 years earlier. "We came with nothing but a wagon and dreams." Martha recalled her weathered hands cradling the teacup. Jim had heard there was land for the taking, opportunity for those willing to work. What they didn't tell us was how the work never ends, fighting the weather, the isolation, the sickness. 3 of our children buried before they reached 10. "How did you endure it?" Clara asked, her pencil poised above her notebook. Martha's eyes grew distant. "You find strength you never knew you had because there's no other choice. You either become hard enough to survive or you break. Most women who came west became steel beneath their calico, or they didn't last long. And you never regretted leaving civilization behind." "Civilization?" Martha snorted. "What does that word even mean? Miss Davenport, indoor plumbing and calling cards out here. I've built something with my own hands. My voice matters in this town. Jim and I are partners in every sense. Would I have had that back east? Or would I have been just another proper wife, silent and decorative?" The question lingered with Clara long after the interview ended. Would she have been satisfied with the life that awaited her in Boston? As Charles Thornton's wife, she would have had material comfort, social standing, respectability. But at what cost to her spirit, her voice, her sense of self? Charles had been the perfect fiancé on paper, handsome, wealthy, from one of Boston's oldest families. But his vision of their future together had never included her aspirations to write, to contribute something meaningful to the world. "A wife's proper sphere is the home, Clara," he'd said more than once, his tone gentle but unyielding. "Your intelligence is charming, but it wouldn't be appropriate to display it so publicly." The memory of those conversations still made her chest tight with a mixture of anger and relief. Breaking their engagement had caused a scandal that had followed her all the way to Wyoming territory, but each day in Cedar Ridge convinced her that she'd made the right choice. On Friday afternoon, and as school ended, Sheriff Bradley stopped by the schoolhouse. His weathered face was grave as he spoke to Clara on the front steps. "Miss Davenport, I wanted to warn you personally. We've had reports of the Garrett gang operating in the area. They're dangerous men, bank robbers, and cattle thieves. I've posted deputies at the north and south ends of town, but it would be wise to be extra cautious for the next few days." "Thank you for the warning, Sheriff," Clara replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Should I be concerned about the children's safety? Keep them close to the schoolhouse for now. No nature walks or outdoor activities until we're sure the danger has passed." He adjusted his hat, squinting at the horizon. "Sent word to Elias McCord, up in the high country. He knows this territory better than anyone, might spot trouble before it reaches town." The mention of Elias sent an unexpected thrill through Clara. She hadn't seen him since their brief encounter outside the general store, but his presence lingered in her thoughts more than she cared to admit. "Is there anything I should do to prepare?" she asked, practical considerations overriding her momentary distraction. Sheriff Bradley considered her question with respect, not dismissing her as a helpless woman. "Keep your doors locked at night. If you hear gunfire, get down low and away from windows. Most importantly, if you see strangers in town who don't look right, find me or one of my deputies immediately." After he left, Clara stood on the schoolhouse steps, the prairie wind tugging at her skirts as she contemplated the sheriff's warning. Danger was an abstract concept in Boston drawing rooms. Here, it took concrete form in men with guns and desperate intentions. That evening, she wrote in her journal, "Sheriff Bradley warned of bandits, today the Garrett gang. His concerns seemed genuine, though he was careful not to frighten me unnecessarily. The women here live with such threats as a matter of course. Martha Henley keeps a shotgun behind the store counter. Patterson mentioned casually that her 10-year-old son is learning to shoot this year. In Boston, such realities would be considered unsuitable topics for female conversation. I wonder if I have the courage these frontier women possess. They face danger without hysterics, practical in their preparations, and clear-eyed about the realities of their situation. Would I react with similar composure if truly threatened? Or would my Eastern upbringing betray me in a moment of crisis? The sheriff mentioned, Elias McCord again, said he knows this territory better than anyone. I find myself curious about this man who has chosen solitude over society, wilderness over comfort. What wisdom has he gained in his isolation? What price has he paid for it? Tomorrow I will visit Emily Patterson to continue my interviews. As a mother of 6 trying to survive on a small ranch, her perspective will be valuable for my project. I must remember to bring paper for Tommy and Mary. They're both avid drawers when given the opportunity. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the first hint of autumn crispness in the air. Clara dressed carefully in a practical blue dress, pinned her grandmother's cameo brooch to her collar, and headed to the schoolhouse to prepare Monday's lessons before her visit to the Patterson Ranch. The town seemed quieter than usual, the sheriff's warning having kept many indoors. A few ranch hands moved cautiously between the livery stable and the saloon, their eyes watchful. 2 deputies stood at opposite ends of the main street, rifles ready. Clara had just reached the schoolhouse steps when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching from the north end of town. She turned to see 5 riders galloping toward the main street, dust billowing behind them like storm clouds. Even from a distance, she could see the bandanas covering their faces and the rifles in their hands. The first shots came as they reached the edge of town, warning shots fired into the air that sent the few people on the street scrambling for cover. One of the deputies returned fire only to fall as a bullet found its mark. Clara stood frozen on the schoolhouse steps, her mind unable to process the sudden eruption of violence. This wasn't supposed to happen, not in daylight, not with the town on alert. Yet here it was, the danger Sheriff Bradley had warned of materializing in terrifying clarity. "Inside, miss, get inside," someone shouted from across the street. But Clara's feet seemed rooted to the steps. She watched in horrified fascination as 3 of the riders dismounted outside the bank, while the other 2 controlled the street with drawn weapons. One of the mounted men turned his horse toward her, probably seeing an easy hostage. Then movement caught her eye, a figure in buckskins emerging from the livery stable. Elias McCord moved with lethal purpose, covering the distance between them in seconds. He reached her just as the mounted outlaw closed in, wrapping a strong arm around her waist and pulling her behind the heavy freight wagon parked in front of the general store. She landed against him with surprising softness, her breath coming in quick gasps. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his gray eyes, the way his hand steadied on his Colt, ready but controlled. He smelled of pine and leather and mountain air, clean and wild, and utterly unlike the cologne-scented men of Boston society. Gunshots echoed around them, the sound amplified by the buildings that lined the street. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs, but a strange calm had settled over her mind. This moment, terrifying as it was, felt more real than any she'd experienced in her previous life. Then Elias spoke, his voice low and rough with something that might have been wonder. "I forgot what woman smelled like." Clara's eyes widened, and for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, they simply looked at each other. Something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits trapped in different forms of isolation. Then, driven by forces neither of them fully understood, he kissed her. It wasn't gentle or practiced. It was the kiss of a man who'd been alone too long, desperate, ungrateful, and shocked by his own need. Her lips were soft under his, and for just that moment the gunfire faded, and the world narrowed to the space between them. When they broke apart, Clara stared at him with wonder and confusion, one hand pressed to her lips. Instead of the outrage or shame a proper Boston lady should have felt, she was conscious only of an overwhelming sense of awakening, as if some dormant part of her had suddenly stirred to life. She had responded to his kiss without hesitation, surprising herself with the intensity of her reaction. This wasn't in any etiquette book or guide to proper behavior. It existed outside the careful boundaries of her previous existence, raw and honest and transformative. The sounds of the real world crashed back, horses galloping away, men shouting, Sheriff Bradley calling for everyone to stay down until the all clear. But Elias McCord, mountain man and hermit, found himself looking into the eyes of Clara Davenport, school teacher and refugee from civilization, and realizing that something fundamental had just changed in both their carefully ordered worlds. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice still rough with emotion. "No," Clara replied, finding her own voice surprisingly steady. "They're getting away. Sheriff's men will pursue them." Elias's hand was still at her waist, as if he couldn't quite bring himself to break contact. "But they won't catch them. Those men know the territory. Slowly, reluctantly, he released her and helped her to her feet. Around them, the town was emerging from hiding shopkeepers cautiously stepping onto the boardwalk, deputies helping the wounded man, Sheriff Bradley organizing a posse. Miss Davenport, Martha Henley hurried toward them, her face pale with concern. Are you all right? We saw that outlaw heading straight for you. I'm fine, Mrs. Henley, Clara assured her, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled only slightly. Mr. McCord intervened just in time. Martha's gaze flickered between them, noting their proximity and the flush in Clara's cheeks. Thank God he was in town today. Those were the Garrett gang, sure as I'm standing here. Sheriff's been warning us they might hit the bank. Elias stepped back, suddenly uncomfortable with the attention. They'll be heading for the high country. Cover their tracks in the broken terrain. Sheriff Bradley approached, his expression grim. Got away with $200 and shot Deputy Collins. He'll live, Doc says, but it was a close thing. He focused on Elias. You think you could track them? Elias nodded, his face settling into lines of determination. I'll need to start now before the trail goes cold. I'll gather a posse, Bradley began, but Elias shook his head. They'll slow me down. I move faster alone. The sheriff didn't argue, recognizing the truth in the statement. Be careful, Elias. These aren't ordinary rustlers. They kill without hesitation. Clara found her voice again. Mr. McCord, surely it's too dangerous for one man to pursue 5 armed outlaws. Elias turned to her, his gray eyes softening slightly. Less dangerous for me than most, Miss Davenport. I know the high country better than they ever will. There was something in his tone that brooked no argument, a quiet confidence that spoke of skills honed through years of survival in hostile territory. Clara realized she was witnessing a different facet of the man she'd glimpsed outside the general store. Not just the grieving widower or the mountain recluse, but someone capable of decisive action when circumstances demanded it. Thank you, she said simply, for what you did. He nodded once, the gesture conveying understanding of everything she wasn't saying. Then he was gone, striding toward the livery stable where his horse waited, his movements fluid and purposeful. Clara watched him go, aware that something profound had shifted in her understanding of herself and this place she'd chosen. The danger had been real, the violence shocking, but she hadn't collapsed in hysterics or frozen in terror. She'd faced it, and in that moment of crisis had discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Come along, dear, Martha urged, taking her arm. Let's get you inside. I'll make some tea with a splash of something stronger. Good for the nerves. As they walked toward the general store, Clara glanced back at the mountains rising beyond the town. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, Elias McCord would be tracking dangerous men with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. And somewhere in those same mountains, she suspected lay answers to questions she was only beginning to formulate. That night, her hand trembled slightly as she wrote in her journal. Today, I witnessed violence firsthand. The Garrett gang attacked Cedar Ridge in broad daylight. Deputy Collins was shot. The bank was robbed. And I discovered something unexpected about myself. When facing genuine danger, I did not fall apart as a proper Boston lady might have. Instead, I felt strangely calm, almost clarified by the experience. Elias McCord saved me from certain capture or worse. He pulled me behind a wagon as bullets flew around us. And then I can barely bring myself to write it, yet I must record the truth. He kissed me. A complete stranger, a man of the wilderness, kissed me amidst gunfire and danger. More shocking still was my response. I kissed him back without hesitation, without thought to propriety or consequence. What does this reveal about the woman I truly am, beneath years of careful training and proper behavior? Who is Clara Davenport when stripped of social constraints and expectations? This question feels more urgent now than ever before. Elias has gone to track the outlaws alone despite Sheriff Bradley's concerns. There is more to this quiet mountain man than grief and solitude. I saw something in his eyes today, a determination and capability that suggests a complex past. Mrs. Henley mentioned he was a different man before his wife's death. I wonder what that man was like and how much of him remains beneath the weathered exterior. The women of Cedar Ridge took today's violence in stride, not dismissing its seriousness, but accepting it as part of frontier reality. Martha Henley had a shotgun in her hands before the outlaws had cleared the street. Mrs. Patterson, who was in town for supplies, hustled her children to safety with calm efficiency. Their resilience continues to impress and inspire me. Tomorrow I will teach my students as usual, maintaining normalcy despite today's events. But I cannot deny that something has changed in my perception of this place, in my understanding of myself, and perhaps most significantly in my awareness of Elias McCord. She closed the journal and placed it in its hiding place, her fingers lingering on the leather cover. Then she touched her lips, gently, still feeling the imprint of an unexpected kiss that had somehow marked the true beginning of her frontier education. 3 days passed with no word from Elias. Sheriff Bradley had organized a proper posse the morning after the robbery, but they'd returned empty-handed, the Garrett gang's trail lost in the maze of canyons and arroyos north of town. Deputy Collins was recovering slowly under Doc Peterson's care, and Cedar Ridge had settled into an uneasy vigilance. Clara maintained her teaching schedule, determined to provide stability for her students despite the lingering tension in town. The children were subdued at first, full of questions about the bad men and whether they would return. Clara answered honestly but reassuringly, preserving their sense of security while acknowledging the realities of frontier life. "My pa says Mr. McCord will catch them," Tommy Patterson announced during the noon break on Tuesday. "Says he can track a bird through a thunderstorm." "Is that true, Miss Davenport?" Little Sarah Wickham asked, her eyes wide. "Can Mr. McCord really do that?" Clara smiled. "I don't know Mr. McCord well enough to say Sarah, but Sheriff Bradley seems to have great confidence in his abilities. He lives all alone up in the mountains," Mary Patterson added with the authority of her 12 years. "Ma says he talks to animals better than people." "Ma says he ain't been right since his wife died," Tommy interjected. "Hasn't been right," Clara corrected gently. "And we shouldn't judge others' choices, especially when they've experienced great loss." The conversation moved on, but Clara found herself contemplating the children's words. Elias McCord had become something of a legend among the younger generation of Cedar Ridge, the mysterious mountain man who appeared and disappeared like a spirit from their parents' stories. The reality, she suspected, was both simpler and more complex than the myths that had grown around him. That afternoon, she visited Emily Patterson at her small ranch 3 miles outside town. The Patterson home was a testament to frontier ingenuity, a log cabin expanded over the years to accommodate a growing family with a vegetable garden, chicken coop, and small corral for horses and milk cows. Emily welcomed her with a baby on her hip and flour dust in her hair. At 28, she had the weathered look of a woman who had lived twice that long, her once pretty face lined with the effort of raising 6 children in harsh conditions. "Come in, Miss Davenport," she said, gesturing toward the cabin's main room. "Don't mind the mess. With 6 little ones and Jim often away with the cattle, keeping things tidy is the least of my worries." Clara settled at the rough-hewn table while Emily prepared coffee, bouncing the fussing infant with practiced ease. The older children were still at school, but a toddler played quietly in the corner with carved wooden animals. "Mrs. Henley mentioned you're interviewing women about their experiences on the frontier," Emily said as she served the coffee in mismatched cups. "Not sure my story's worth much telling, but I'm happy to share it." "Every story matters," Clara assured her, opening her notebook, "especially those that might never be heard otherwise." Emily's tale unfolded gradually, her journey west at 16 with her family, the harsh Kansas winter that claimed her parents and younger brother, her marriage to Jim Patterson at 17, more for survival than love, though the love came later, and the births of her children in conditions that would horrify Boston doctors. The fourth one, that was Tommy, came during a blizzard, Emily recalled absently, stroking the baby's downy head. Jim was trapped at the north pasture, nearest neighbor 5 miles away. Just me and Mary, who was only 4 then, in the cabin. Had to deliver him myself, cut the cord with kitchen shears. Clara made notes, struck by the matter-of-fact way Emily described experiences that would be considered unmentionable in polite Eastern society. "Were you afraid?" she asked. Emily considered the question. "Didn't have time for fear. Out here, you do what needs doing or you don't survive. Fear is a luxury for people with options." The interview continued as the afternoon waned, touching on Emily's hopes for her children. Mary, smart as a whip, could be a real doctor with proper schooling, and the realities of ranch life during difficult times. As Clara prepared to leave, Emily walked her to the door. "Miss Davenport, may I offer some advice? Woman to woman." "Of course. This country changes people, sometimes for better, sometimes not. I've seen delicate Eastern flowers wither and die here, and I've seen unlikely souls put down roots and flourish. The difference isn't education or breeding or social graces. It's whether you can bend without breaking, adapt without losing yourself entirely. Clara nodded, understanding the wisdom behind the words. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I'll remember that. And one more thing, Emily added, lowering her voice, though no one was near enough to hear. Be careful with Elias McCord. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. I hardly know Mr. McCord. Emily's smile was knowing but kind. News travels fast in small towns. Martha Henley mentioned how he pulled you to safety during the robbery, said there was something in the way you looked at each other afterward. She shifted the baby to her other hip. Elias is a good man, one of the best I've known, but he's also damaged in ways that may never heal. His heart's like one of those abandoned mines up in the mountains, deep and dark and liable to collapse if you venture too far in. The warning stayed with Clara during her ride back to town, mingling with her own confused feelings about the mountain man who had kissed her amidst gunfire and danger. She had experienced attraction before the courtly attentions of Boston suitors, the more insistent pursuit of her former fiancé. But this was different, raw, and unexpected, like the land itself. She was still contemplating Emily's words the next morning as her students filed into the schoolhouse. The day began normally enough, arithmetic for the older children, reading practice for the younger ones. Little Sarah Wickham proudly showed Clara a drawing she'd made of Mr. McCord fighting the bad men, a childish but surprisingly detailed rendering of a buckskin-clad figure facing off against bandana-masked outlaws. This is very good, Sarah, Clara said, genuinely impressed by the girl's observational skills. You've captured Mr. McCord's posture perfectly. Sarah beamed at the praise. He brings me peppermint candy sometimes. Says I remind him of someone. Before Clara could respond, a commotion outside drew her attention. Through the schoolhouse windows, she could see riders approaching 5 men on horseback, moving with the casual confidence of those accustomed to taking what they wanted. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the leader from 3 days ago, a tall man with a black beard and cold eyes that seemed to catalog everything as either useful or expendable. Children, she said quietly, move away from the windows quickly now, but don't run. Young Tommy Patterson's face had gone pale. Is it them again, Miss Davenport? The bad men. Before she could answer, the schoolhouse door burst open. Jake Garrett stood in the doorway, his long coat dusty from the trail, a Colt revolver hanging loose in his right hand. Behind him, 2 of his men took positions that blocked any escape. Well now, Garrett said, his voice carrying a soft drawl that made the words somehow more menacing. What have we here, a proper schoolmarm and her little scholars? Clara stepped protectively in front of her students, her heart hammering against her ribs. This is a school, sir. These are children. Whatever business you have in Cedar Ridge, surely it doesn't involve them. Garrett's laugh was like gravel grinding. Oh, but it does involve them, ma'am. See, we've decided Cedar Ridge is perfectly situated for our purposes. Good grazing land, water access, and far enough from the railroad to give us time to work. But we need the townspeople to understand their new situation. He moved further into the room, and Clara caught the smell of unwashed clothes and violence that seemed to cling to him like smoke. You're going to help us with that understanding schoolmarm. You're going to send a message to your sheriff and that mountain man who thinks he's some kind of hero. I don't know what you're talking about, Clara said, though her voice betrayed her fear. Of course you do. Big fellow Buckskins pulled you behind that wagon the other day. Word is he's some kind of tracker, lives up in the high country. We can't have him interfering with our business. One of the children whimpered, and Clara's protective instincts overrode her terror. Leave the children out of this. Whatever message you want to send, you can send it through me, but let them go. Garrett studied her with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up prey. You've got spine, I'll give you that, but you don't seem to understand your situation here. See, we need these good people to know that resistance has consequences. And children, well, children make the point better than most anything else. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his threat. Through the window, Clara could see Sheriff Bradley riding hard toward the school, his face grim with determination. Behind him came Martha Henley and several other townspeople, including Doc Peterson with his medical bag. Looks like we've got company, one of Garrett's men said. Expected as much, Garrett replied. This works out even better. He grabbed Clara's arm, roughly pulling her toward the door. You're coming with the schoolmarm. These children can deliver our message. No, Clara tried to pull away, but his grip was iron strong. Listen up, children, Garrett called out as he dragged her toward the door. You tell Sheriff Bradley and that mountain man that we've got their pretty teacher. They want her back. They'll need to discuss terms, and those terms don't include any heroics or tracking parties. As they reached the doorway, a shot rang out from somewhere behind the school. Garrett cursed and shoved Clara roughly toward his waiting horse. Mount up, we've got company. The next few minutes were chaos. More gunshots erupted as townspeople took defensive positions. Clara found herself thrown across the saddle of Garrett's horse, the world spinning as they galloped away from Cedar Ridge toward the broken country north of town. Behind them, Sheriff Bradley and his hastily assembled posse gave chase, but the gang had planned their escape route well. Within minutes, they disappeared into the maze of canyons and arroyos that carved the landscape like old scars. Clara fought against nausea as she was carried farther from town. Her body jarred painfully with each stride of the horse. Her mind raced with fragments of thought, concern for her students, fear for her own safety, and strangely wonder at whether Elias would indeed come for her, as Garrett seemed to believe he would. After what seemed like hours but was probably less than one, the gang slowed their pace, confident they had lost their pursuers. Garrett pulled Clara upright, allowing her to sit properly on the horse in front of him, though his arm remained locked around her waist like an iron band. You're causing me a lot of trouble, schoolmarm, he said, his breath hot against her ear. Almost more than you're worth. Then let me go, Clara suggested, striving for a calm she didn't feel. Return to Cedar Ridge. I'll tell them I escaped on my own. No one needs to be hurt, the outlaw chuckled. You've got sand, I'll give you that. But you're missing the point of this exercise. We're sending a message, and that message needs to be clear. Cedar Ridge belongs to the Garrett gang now. Anyone who opposes that arrangement will suffer, starting with their precious schoolteacher. They rode in silence for a time, climbing higher into the broken country that formed a natural barrier between the settled ranchlands and the true wilderness beyond. Clara tried to memorize landmarks, but the unfamiliar terrain and her limited experience with the wilderness made it difficult to form a coherent mental map. As they traveled, she studied her captors with the same observational skills she applied to her interviews. Jake Garrett was clearly the leader, older, more calculating than the others, with the kind of patience that made him dangerous. His second in command, a lean man called Pike, watched her with predatory eyes that made her skin crawl. The other three were followers, dangerous in their unpredictability, but lacking the cold intelligence that made Garrett truly terrifying. What surprised her most was Garrett himself. Despite his rough exterior and violent methods, he occasionally used words and phrases that suggested education references to Shakespeare complex vocabulary that seemed at odds with his outlaw persona. You're wondering about me, he said, suddenly catching her assessment. Trying to figure out how a man like me ends up leading a gang of outlaws. Clara didn't deny it. You seem unexpected. He laughed, a sound with genuine amusement rather than menace. Life's full of unexpected turns, Miss Davenport. Or is it Mrs. No Ring on your finger, but a woman your age with your refinement should have been married off long ago? Miss, she confirmed, unsettled by his perception. I came west to teach. Did you now all the way from Boston or thereabouts, judging by your accent? Left behind a life of comfort for the Wyoming territory. He clicked his tongue. Now that's unexpected. What were you running from, I wonder? Clara stiffened. I wasn't running from anything. I was running towards something. Same difference in the end, Garrett observed. We're all either running from something or chasing after it. Question is whether we recognize which one we're doing. This philosophical bent was the last thing Clara had expected from an outlaw, and it made him more disturbing, not less. A simple brute would have been easier to categorize to defend against mentally. This complex, educated man who had chosen violence as his path raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and the thin veneer of civilization. By late afternoon, they reached what Garrett called Devil's Canyon, a maze of red rock walls that rose like ancient cathedrals around their makeshift camp. Clara found herself bound and seated against a boulder, her wrists secured with rough rope that chafed her skin. Comfortable, school marm? Garrett asked, crouching beside a small fire and studying a hand-drawn map. As comfortable as one can be when kidnapped by criminals, Clara replied, pleased that her voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Garrett chuckled. Got spirit, I'll give you that. Most Eastern ladies would be crying by now. He folded the map and stood walking over to where she sat. Question is, how much is that spirit worth to your mountain man friend? I hardly know, Mr. McCord, Clara said, though the words felt false on her tongue. If you think he'll risk his life for a stranger, you're mistaken. Oh, but you're not strangers, are you? Garrett's eyes held a knowing glint. My boys saw that little scene behind the freight wagon. Man doesn't kiss a woman like that unless she means something to him. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her expression neutral. You're mistaken, it was merely the confusion of the moment. Maybe. He studied her with unsettling intensity. Guess we'll find out soon enough. As night fell over Devil's Canyon, Clara assessed her situation with growing clarity. The outlaws had made camp in a natural fortress with only one obvious way in or out. They'd positioned guards and prepared for a potential rescue attempt, confident in their advantage of numbers and position. But they had overlooked something significant, the cameo brooch pinned to her collar, its delicate ivory carved into the profile of a woman from another era. The pin was sharp, designed to pierce heavy fabric and hold securely, if she could work it free without being observed. Carefully making her movements so small they wouldn't attract attention, Clara began to manipulate the brooch with bound hands. The familiar weight of it against her throat provided strange comfort, a connection to her grandmother, who had faced her own challenges with quiet dignity in a different time and place. Tell me about your mountain man, Garrett said, settling beside the fire as evening shadows crept across the canyon floor. There's nothing to tell. I barely know him. But you know enough to let him kiss you in front of half the town. Garrett's smile was sharp as a skinning knife. Man like that doesn't show himself unless he's got reason. Question is, what kind of reason? Clara remained silent, but her mind was racing. The truth was she didn't understand what had passed between her and Elias McCord any more than Garrett did. The kiss had been impulsive, born from danger and proximity, but there had been something deeper in it, a recognition that transcended rational thought. He'll come, Pike said from across the fire. Mountain men are territorial about their women. He'll come, and when he does, we'll be ready. Maybe, Garrett said thoughtfully. Or maybe he's smart enough to know 5 against 1 isn't good odds, no matter how handy he is with that Colt. As night settled over the canyon, Clara worked steadily at the brooch, feeling it loosen from the fabric of her dress. Her thoughts turned to her students. Were they safe? Had their parents managed to calm their fears? Or were they lying awake wondering if the bad men would come back? The thought of those trusting young faces gave her strength, even as her situation grew more precarious. She thought of little Sarah Wickham's gap-toothed smile, of Tommy Patterson's earnest questions, of Mary's quiet determination to become a doctor, despite all odds. They represented everything she had come west to find, possibility unbound by convention dreams, limited only by one's courage to pursue them. And then there was Elias McCord, the enigmatic mountain man, whose kiss had awakened something in her she hadn't known existed. Would he indeed come for her, tracking her through this hostile terrain with the skills he'd honed during years of solitude? Or would he remain in his high country sanctuary untouched by the violence below? Clara didn't know the answer, but as the brooch finally came free in her hands, its sharp pin gleaming in the firelight, she made a decision. Whether rescue came or not, she would not play the helpless victim in this frontier drama. Boston propriety be damned, she would fight for her survival with every weapon at her disposal, including the delicate heirloom that now felt like a lifeline in her trembling fingers. Miles away on the rim of a canyon bathed in moonlight, Elias McCord knelt to examine the tracks that would lead him to Clara Davenport and the men who had taken her. His face was set in lines of grim determination, his gray eyes cold as winter stone. The hunt had begun. 20 miles from Clara's captivity, Elias knelt beside a stream where the gang's horses had stopped to drink. The tracks told him they were moving with purpose, not randomly fleeing. These men knew the country, or at least one of them did. More troubling, they seemed confident enough to take time for rest stops, which suggested they weren't particularly worried about pursuit. His hand went unconsciously to the worn gold band he still wore on a leather cord around his neck. Sarah's wedding ring, the one physical reminder of the life they'd shared. For 7 years, it had been a weight of memory and guilt, a chain that bound him to the past. Now, for the first time since her death, he felt the stirring of something that might challenge that bond. Sarah had been 19 when they married, mountain-born and raised to frontier life. She'd known how to read weather, and sign could skin a deer and birth a calf with equal skill. She'd died in a blizzard while he was away, checking trap lines caught by a sudden storm that turned their valley into a white hell. He'd found her 3 days later, frozen in their cabin, and the guilt had nearly destroyed him. Clara Davenport was everything Sarah hadn't been educated, refined, born to gentler circumstances. Yet there had been something in her eyes during that moment of danger, a core of strength that reminded him what it felt like to want to protect someone, to feel responsible for another person's happiness and safety. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had failed to protect Sarah, the woman who knew the mountains almost as well as he did. What chance did he have of saving a Boston schoolteacher from hardened outlaws in terrain she'd never navigated? But the question didn't slow his pace as he followed the trail deeper into the broken country. The tracks led into the maze of canyons and washes that locals called the Devil's Playground, 1,000 square miles of red rock formations, hidden valleys, and narrow trails known only to those who had spent years exploring its secrets. It was perfect territory for outlaws looking to disappear and a nightmare for pursuing posses. But Elias wasn't a posse. He was a single man moving like a shadow through landscape he'd learned to read as clearly as any book. The signs were there for those who knew how to look a displaced stone, a broken twig, the faint imprint of a horseshoe in ground, too hard for most trackers to read. By late afternoon, he found where the gang had stopped for their first extended rest. They'd chosen well a hidden grove beside a spring, screened by cottonwoods and protected by natural rock barriers. The signs told him Clara was unharmed but frightened. Her footprints showed she'd been allowed to walk around, though always under guard. More importantly, he'd identified their destination. The tracks pointed toward Devil's Canyon, a natural fortress that had been used by Apache's outlaws and Army deserters for generations. There were only 3 ways into the canyon, and all of them were easily defended by men with rifles and patience. But Elias knew something the Garrett gang probably didn't. There was a 4th way in a narrow chimney climb that few men would attempt and fewer still would survive. It was the kind of route that required absolute trust in your equipment and a willingness to risk everything on handholds worn smooth by centuries of wind and water. As he made camp that evening, still hours away from the canyon, Elias found himself remembering Sarah's voice. She'd always been practical about death, accepting it as part of mountain life, the way she accepted harsh winters and dry summers. "When my time comes," she'd told him once while they watched snow fall outside their cabin, "don't you spend the rest of your life mourning me. Promise me that, Elias. Promise me you'll find reason to keep living." He'd made that promise, but keeping it had proved harder than either of them had imagined. For 7 years, he'd existed rather than lived, maintaining his body while letting his heart grow cold as winter stone. Now, as he prepared to risk everything for a woman who'd been a stranger 4 days ago, he wondered if Sarah would approve. The thought brought a bitter smile to his lips. Sarah had always been generous with her affections, quick to welcome strangers, and slower to judge than most frontier women. She probably would have liked Clara. Davenport would have admired her courage in coming west alone and her determination to build something meaningful from the raw materials of frontier life. The stars emerged one by one above the broken country, and somewhere among those twisted canyons and hidden valleys, armed men held a brave woman captive. Tomorrow would bring the kind of violence that defined frontier justice, the sort of reckoning that left some men dead and others forever changed. Elias checked his weapons, the Colt at his hip, the rifle across his saddle, the hunting knife that had saved his life more times than he could count. Then he settled back against his saddle and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow he would discover whether a man could love twice in one lifetime and whether some promises were worth breaking in order to keep others. Dawn was still hours away when Elias began his approach to Devil's Canyon. The moon hung low in the western sky, providing just enough light to navigate the treacherous terrain without using a torch that might alert the outlaws to his presence. He left patients hidden in a sheltered draw with enough water and grazing to last a day. The mare watched him go with what might have been concern in her intelligent eyes. She'd carried him faithfully through 7 years of solitude, seemingly understanding his need for silence and distance from human connection. Now she seemed equally aware that he was moving toward rather than away from human entanglement. "I'll be back," he promised, patting her neck one last time before disappearing into the darkness. The climb to the canyon rim took 3 hours of careful navigation through boulder fields and along game trails too narrow for horses. By the time he reached the overlook, the eastern sky had begun to lighten, the stars fading as night retreated before the approaching day. Below him, the maze of red rock walls twisted and turned like a serpent carved from stone. Somewhere in that labyrinth, Clara Davenport waited for rescue or death, and 5 desperate men prepared to kill anyone foolish enough to attempt either. The main entrance to the canyon was a narrow gap between towering walls easily defended and impossible to approach without being seen. The second entrance was little better a steep trail that switchbacked down the eastern wall, exposed to rifle fire for most of its length. The third was a treacherous descent that required ropes and skill, but ended in a box canyon with no way out. But the fourth way, the route Elias had discovered during his early years in the mountains, was different. It was a chimney climb up the back wall of the canyon, a vertical crack in the rock face that a man could wedge himself into and climb by, pressing his back against one wall and his feet against the other. It was dangerous, exhausting, and would leave him exposed if anyone happened to look up at the wrong moment. It was also his only chance of reaching Clara before the gang decided she was more trouble than she was worth. As he prepared his equipment, Elias found himself thinking about the woman who had disrupted his carefully ordered solitude. There had been courage in her eyes when she faced down armed men to protect her students, the kind of quiet bravery that reminded him why some things were worth fighting for. Sarah had possessed that same courage, the frontier woman's ability to face hardship without complaint and danger without panic. But where Sarah had been shaped by mountain life from birth, Clara had chosen to embrace the frontier, despite being raised for gentler circumstances. That choice, Elias realized, might require even greater courage. The climb began just after midnight, when the moon was high enough to provide light, but the camp below would be settled into sleep patterns. Elias moved like a shadow up the rock face, his muscles burning with the effort of supporting his weight against gravity's relentless pull. Halfway up, he paused to rest, pressed into the narrow chimney like a fly on a wall. Below him, the canyon floor lay in darkness, broken only by the dying embers of the gang's fire. He could make out the shapes of sleeping men wrapped in blankets and the smaller figure that had to be Clara positioned where any escape attempt would wake her guards. The final 100 feet were the worst, where the chimney narrowed and the rock became smooth from centuries of water flow. By the time he reached the canyon floor, Elias was exhausted and his buckskin shirt was torn in 3 places. But he was inside their perimeter, and that changed everything. He spent an hour observing the camp, learning the rhythm of the guards and identifying escape routes. Pike was on watch, making a slow circuit of the camp every 15 minutes. The others slept heavily, confident in their position and their leader's planning. Clara lay apart from the outlaws, her hands bound, but her spirit unbroken. Even in sleep, she maintained the dignity that had first caught his attention, as if her breeding and education were armor against the degradation of captivity. As dawn approached, Elias made his decision. A direct assault would likely result in Clara's death. Desperate men used hostages as shields, and Garrett struck him as the type who'd kill her rather than lose his advantage. But there might be another way, a strategy that would require patience and nerve, but offered better odds of success. He retreated to a position where he could watch the camp without being seen and settled in to wait. Rescue, he'd learned during his years in the mountains, was often a matter of timing rather than firepower. The right moment could make one man worth 5, while the wrong moment could turn heroes into corpses. Clara woke to the scent of coffee and the low murmur of men's voices. For a moment, disoriented by sleep, she thought she was back in her Boston home with servants preparing breakfast below. Then reality rushed back: the kidnapping, the long ride to Devil's Canyon, the rope around her wrist that had chafed her skin raw despite her efforts to loosen it with the cameo pin. She kept her eyes closed, feigning continued sleep while she assessed her situation. The brooch was hidden in her sleeve, its pin straightened and ready for use. Her hands were bound in front of her, rather than behind a small mercy that would make her task easier. The outlaws seemed relaxed, confident in their security. No one was watching her directly at the moment. Slowly, carefully, she began working the pin against the rope fibers, a fraction of an inch at a time. The work was tedious and painful, each movement risking discovery. But Clara had found a well of patience within herself that she hadn't known existed, a calm determination that seemed to have been waiting for this moment of crisis to reveal itself. "Coffee school, marm," Garrett's voice interrupted her work. She quickly concealed the pin and opened her eyes to find him standing over her, a tin cup in his outstretched hand. "Yes, thank you." Her voice was hoarse from thirst. He crouched beside her, studying her face with unsettling intensity. You slept well for a hostage. Most folks in your situations spend the night weeping or plotting hopeless escapes. Clara accepted the coffee with bound hands, grateful for its warmth despite the circumstances. Hysteria wouldn't improve my situation. Garrett chuckled. Pragmatic. I like that in a woman. He settled beside her, his rifle across his knees. Your mountain man hasn't shown himself yet. Maybe he values his skin more than yours after all. As I told you, Mr. McCord and I barely know each other. Your assumption that he would risk his life for me is based on a misunderstanding. Is it now? Garrett's eyes narrowed. Then why did my boys spot fresh sign on the North Rim last night? Someone's out there watching. Someone who knows how to move without being seen. Clara's heart leaped at the news, though she kept her expression neutral. If Elias was indeed nearby planning a rescue, the last thing she wanted was to betray him with her reaction. Perhaps it's Sheriff Bradley's posse, she suggested. They wouldn't abandon the search so quickly. Sheriff and his men are fumbling around 10 miles south of here, Garrett said dismissively. Couldn't track a wagon through mud. No, this is different. This is someone who knows what he's doing. He stood adjusting his gun belt, which is why we're moving you deeper into the canyon today. Make it harder for your friend to play hero. As he walked away, Clara resumed her careful work on the ropes. The news that Elias might be near gave her renewed determination. She needed to be ready when opportunity presented itself, whether through rescue or her own efforts. Throughout the morning, she observed the camp with the same attention to detail she brought to her interviews. The outlaws were not the homogeneous group she had initially assumed. Garrett was clearly educated, probably from a good family, before whatever circumstances had driven him to outlawry. Pike was a natural predator, dangerous in the way of a wolf or mountain lion without malice but without mercy. The others were followers of varying competence, bound to Garrett by fear or loyalty or lack of better options. Their camp was well organized with clear sight lines in all directions and escape routes planned. These were not random bandits, but experienced men who had survived in a brutal profession through planning and discipline. That made them more dangerous, but also more predictable. By midday, Clara had frayed the rope enough that she believed she could break free with one sharp movement if necessary. She concealed her progress beneath the folds of her skirt, waiting and watching for the right moment. It came when Garrett sent two of his men, a stocky outlaw called Bronson, and a younger man who answered to Kid, to explore a side canyon they'd spotted during their arrival. This reduced the force in camp from 5 to 3 and spread the remaining men thinner. Keep an eye on her, Garrett instructed Pike as he moved to the canyon entrance to check for signs of pursuit. She's smarter than she looks. Pike nodded, settling on a boulder where he could watch both Clara and the approach to the camp. His rifle lay across his knees and his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the terrain with the instincts of a born hunter. Clara knew this might be her best opportunity. With the gang separated and attention divided, a distraction now could create the chaos necessary for escape. But she needed to be careful. A failed attempt would only result in tighter bonds and closer watching. She was considering her options when a shot rang out from the direction Bronson and Kid had gone, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Pike was on his feet instantly, his rifle ready as he scanned the rocks above the camp. What was that? Garrett called, hurrying back from his position at the canyon mouth. Gunshot north side, canyon. Pike reported, his voice tense. Could be Bronson found something, or someone found them. Garrett cursed under his breath. Check it out. I'll watch the woman. As Pike moved cautiously toward the source of the shot, Clara felt the air around them change, a subtle shift in the quality of silence that raised the hair on the back of her neck. Something was happening. Something the outlaws hadn't planned for. Garrett must have felt it too. His posture stiffened, and his eyes darted from shadow to shadow, searching for threats that remained invisible. McCord, he called out, his voice bouncing off the canyon walls. I know you're out there. You want the woman. You come down here and face me like a man. Silence answered him, broken only by the whisper of wind through the rocks. Maybe he can't hear you, Claire suggested mildly, continuing to work at her bonds while Garrett's attention was divided. Garrett spun towards her, his eyes wild with rage and fear. Shut up! Just shut up and let me think! He grabbed her roughly by the shoulder, hauling her to her feet. You're coming with me. We're getting out of this canyon, and if your mountain man tries to stop us, I'll put a bullet in your spine." Clara felt the last strands of rope give way, but she kept her hands positioned as if still bound. "Where exactly do you plan to go? You've been riding with this gang for years. Every lawman in 3 territories knows your face." "Mexico," Garrett said, dragging her toward where the horses were picketed. "Plenty of places a man can disappear south of the border, especially a man with money to spend." As they moved across the camp, Clara caught sight of movement among the rocks, a brief glimpse of buckskin and the gleam of metal. Elias was positioning himself for a shot, but Garrett was using her as a human shield, staying directly behind her as they approached the horses. "You're making a mistake," Clara said, stalling for time. "Even if you escape, you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. Is that any way to live?" "Better than being dead," Garrett replied. But there was doubt in his voice now. The careful plan that had brought him to this canyon was falling apart, and he was smart enough to know it. Clara made her decision. As they reached the horses, she suddenly went limp, dropping her full weight against Garrett's arm. The unexpected move threw him off balance, and for just a moment, Clara was clear of his line of fire. The rifle shot came from above the bullet, striking Garrett in the shoulder and spinning him around. He cursed and tried to bring his own weapon to bear, but Clara was already moving, rolling away and putting as much distance as possible between herself and the wounded outlaw. Garrett fired wildly at the rocks above his shots, echoing uselessly off stone. A second bullet from Elias's rifle took him in the leg, dropping him to one knee, but not stopping his desperate attempt to locate his attacker. "Give it up, Garrett." Elias's voice rang out from the canyon walls. "Your men are down, you're wounded, and there's nowhere to run." "Go to hell!" Garrett screamed back, still firing randomly at the surrounding rocks. Clara had reached the relative safety of a boulder pile, her heart pounding with adrenaline and relief. Through gaps in the rocks, she could see Elias making his way down from his elevated position, moving with the fluid grace of a man completely at home in dangerous terrain. The final confrontation was swift and decisive. Garrett, weakened by blood loss and consumed by rage, made the mistake of exposing himself as he tried to get a clear shot at Elias. The mountain man's rifle spoke once more, and Jake Garrett fell forward into the dust, his reign of terror ended by superior skill and desperate courage. Silence settled over the canyon like a shroud. Clara emerged from her hiding place on unsteady legs, her refined dress torn and dirty, but her spirit unbroken. Elias approached carefully, his rifle still ready despite Garrett's obvious death. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "I'm alive," Clara replied, and suddenly that seemed like the most important thing in the world. "Thanks to you." They stood facing each other across the body of the man who'd threatened to destroy everything they might have built together. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities, and the knowledge that they'd both risked everything for something that neither fully understood. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wooden horse he'd carved during the long winter nights. "Made this for little Sarah Wickham," he said quietly. "Thought you might want to give it to her when we get back." Clara took the tiny figure, marveling at the delicate craftsmanship that revealed so much about the man who'd created it. "You have gentle hands for someone so dangerous," she observed. "Had to learn to be both," Elias replied. "Gentle enough to carve toys, dangerous enough to protect what matters." As they prepared to leave Devil's Canyon behind, Clara realized that her mother's cameo brooch, the symbol of her refined past, had been lost somewhere during the struggle. But looking at the simple wooden horse in her palm, she found she didn't mind. Some treasures, she was learning, were worth more than the heirlooms of the past. Sheriff Tom Bradley's badge gleamed dully in the lamplight of his office as he pinned it to Elias McCord's buckskin vest. The old lawman's hands shook slightly, whether from emotion or the pain of his wounds, Clara couldn't tell. What she could see was the weight of responsibility passing from one man to another, like a torch being handed down through generations of those who chose to stand between civilization and chaos. "Been wearing this star for 15 years, Tom said, his voice rough from the bullet that had grazed his throat during the Garrett's second attack on Cedar Ridge. "Never thought I'd be handing it over like this." The attack had come at dawn, 3 days after Elias brought Clara back from Devil's Canyon. The Garrett gang, it turned out, had been larger than anyone suspected. Jake Garrett's death had only eliminated the advance team. The real threat came from his brother, Cole, and 8 hardened outlaws who'd been waiting in the hills north of town for word that Cedar Ridge was secure. When that word never came, Cole Garrett had decided to take the town by force. Sheriff Bradley had been shot down in the first minutes, along with two townsmen who tried to rally a defense. Only Elias's wilderness-honed reflexes had prevented a complete massacre. He'd been at the livery stable when the shooting started, and his tactical response had turned a rout into a fighting retreat. But the cost had been too high for a community that had never asked for war. Jim Henley had taken a bullet in the shoulder, and young Tommy Patterson, who'd insisted on helping, despite his mother's protests, had been grazed by flying splinters when a bullet shattered the storefront window where he was hiding. "This isn't your fight," Clara said quietly as Elias adjusted the unfamiliar weight of the badge. "You don't owe this town anything." Elias looked at her with those steady gray eyes that had first captured her attention. "Maybe not, but I owe you something. And you care about these people. That makes it my fight." The transformation in him was subtle but unmistakable. The mountain hermit was disappearing, replaced by something harder and more purposeful. Clara could see glimpses of the man he'd been before Sarah's death, someone accustomed to leadership and the weight of other people's lives. "Besides," he continued, "Cole Garrett won't stop with Cedar Ridge. He'll keep moving, keep killing, until someone stops him permanently. Might as well be here. Might as well be now." Doc Peterson looked up from where he was tending Sheriff Bradley's wounds. "The nearest federal marshals are in Cheyenne. 3 days' ride if the weather holds. We sent word with the morning stage, but 3 days might as well be 3 years." "Garrett won't wait," Elias finished. "He'll hit us again tonight, probably around midnight, when he thinks we'll be tired and careless." Martha Henley set down a tray of coffee cups with more force than necessary. "So what do we do?" "Half the men are talking about loading their families in wagons and heading for Fort Collins." "Running won't solve anything," Elias said firmly. "Garrett's got 8 men and a grudge. He'll hunt down anyone who runs, pick them off one by one on the open prairie. Our only chance is to make our stand here where we know the ground and can control the approaches." Pastor Williams spoke up from his corner near the window. "You're talking about turning our town into a battlefield." "It's already a battlefield," Elias replied. "Question is whether we fight or surrender." Clara found herself thinking about her students scattered to homes throughout the territory as their families fled or prepared for siege. Little Sarah Wickham's family had been among the first to load a wagon heading south toward her uncle's ranch near Colorado Springs. Tommy Patterson's father had barricaded his house and sworn to fight, while Mary Patterson had been sent to stay with relatives in Cheyenne, her mother unwilling to risk both children in what might become a bloodbath. "What about the women and children who can't leave?" Clara asked. "Church basement," Elias said without hesitation. "Stone foundation, thick walls, only one entrance. We can defend it if everything else goes wrong." The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation as Cedar Ridge transformed from a peaceful frontier town into an armed camp. Men who'd spent their lives farming and storekeeping learned to stack sandbags and create firing positions. Women who'd never touched weapons beyond kitchen knives practiced loading rifles and pistols under Doc Peterson's patient instruction. Clara found herself appointed to coordinate the defense of the church, a responsibility that would have terrified her 3 months ago, but now felt like a natural extension of her teaching duties. Instead of helping children with arithmetic, she was helping their mothers prepare for the possibility of widowhood. As afternoon faded into evening, Elias made his rounds of the defensive positions like a general inspecting his troops. But these weren't professional soldiers. They were ordinary people who'd chosen to risk everything rather than surrender their homes to outlaws and murderers. "You know this could go badly," Clara said when he stopped by the church to check on the women's preparations. "Could," Elias agreed, "but it could also go very well. And either way, these people will know they didn't go down without a fight. Is that enough? Is that worth dying for?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the mountains that had been his home for so many years. "I used to think the only thing worth dying for was something you had already lost. Turns out I was wrong." Before Clara could ask what he meant, a shout from the street interrupted them. One of the lookouts had spotted riders approaching from the north. Not the full gang, but 3 men carrying a white flag. Cole Garrett had come to parley. Clara followed Elias to the main street, where a small crowd had gathered to witness the confrontation. Cole Garrett looked like a harder, meaner version of his dead brother. Where Jake had possessed a certain rough charisma, Cole radiated pure malevolence, the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of taking what he wanted and killing anyone who objected. "You've got something that belongs to me," he called out when he was still 50 yards from the main street. "My brother's body and his personal effects. I'm here to collect them." Elias stepped out into the street, his hand resting easy on the butt of his Colt. "Your brother's in the ground where he belongs. As for his effects, what makes you think a dead outlaw's property is worth more than the lives of innocent people?" Cole's smile was cold as winter stone. "Because I've got 8 good men who'll burn this town to the ground if I give the word. You want these people to live? You give me what I came for and throw in that school marm as compensation for my trouble." "Counteroffer," Elias said calmly. "You ride out now and I'll let you keep breathing until the federal marshals catch up with you." The laugh that erupted from Cole Garrett was like breaking glass. "You think that tin star makes you something special? I've killed more lawmen than you've probably met. Maybe, baby, but you've never killed me." The parley ended there with threats hanging in the air like gun smoke. As the 3 outlaws rode back toward their hidden camp, everyone in Cedar Ridge understood that the real battle was still to come. "He'll attack at midnight," Elias told the assembled defenders as full darkness settled over the town. "Classic outlaw tactic. Wait until people are tired and jumpy, then hit fast and hard from multiple directions." "How do you know so much about outlaw tactics?" asked Jim Patterson, Tommy's father, his arm in a sling from a wound received during the first attack. Elias was quiet for a moment, and Clara saw something flicker across his face, old memories surfacing like fish in dark water. "Learned a few things during the war. Tactics don't change much whether you're fighting Confederates or outlaws." It was the first time he'd mentioned his past as a soldier, and Clara filed the information away with all the other pieces of the puzzle that was Elias McCord. There were depths to this man that would take years to explore, assuming they lived long enough to have years together. As the defenders took their positions and the town settled into an uneasy quiet, Clara realized that Sheriff Bradley's badge represented more than just authority. It represented the willingness to stand between chaos and order, to risk everything for people who might never fully understand the price of their safety. Tomorrow, if they survived, Cedar Ridge would be different. They all would be different. But tonight they stood together against the darkness, and that would have to be enough. The hours crept by with excruciating slowness. Clara moved among the women gathered in the church basement, offering encouragement and practical assistance. Martha Henley had organized them into shifts, some resting, while others stood watch rifles ready at the small windows that provided limited visibility of the street outside. "Never thought I'd be teaching proper ladies to shoot," Martha commented, as she demonstrated the loading sequence to Emily Patterson for the 3rd time. "My mother would turn in her grave." "I suspect many of our mothers would," Clara agreed, checking the priming on her own borrowed rifle. The weapon felt strange in her hands, heavy and deadly, and somehow symbolic of how far she'd come from the drawing rooms of Boston. "But I also suspect they faced their own battles in their own ways." "That's the truth of it," Martha nodded. "My mother crossed the Ohio in flood to get us to safety when Indians attacked our settlement. Didn't have a gun, but she had courage enough for 10 men. Similar conversations echoed throughout the basement, women sharing stories of resilience and survival, finding common ground in experiences that transcended social class and upbringing. Clara listened, memorizing details for her journal, though she wondered if she would live to record them. Outside, Elias made his final preparations. He'd positioned men at strategic points throughout town: the general store, the livery stable, the sheriff's office, and on the roofs of several buildings that offered clear fields of fire. Jim Henley, despite his wounded shoulder, insisted on defending his store alongside 3 ranch hands. Doc Peterson and Pastor Williams had set up a field hospital in the schoolhouse, ready to tend the wounded when the shooting started. As midnight approached, Elias found himself standing alone on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching the stars wheel overhead. The night was clear and cold, with the first hint of autumn frost silvering the boardwalks. It reminded him of other nights spent watching and waiting during a war that had torn the country apart and left scars that would never fully heal. He hadn't thought about those days in years, deliberately pushing the memories away as he retreated into the wilderness. But now, preparing to lead men into battle once again, the past returned with startling clarity. He remembered the weight of command, the knowledge that his decisions would determine who lived and who died. He remembered the sick feeling in his gut before each engagement, not fear for himself, but for those who trusted him. And he remembered Sarah, who had saved him when he returned from the war, broken in ways that weren't visible to the eye. She had helped him rebuild himself piece by jagged piece until he could face each day without the nightmares that had haunted his sleep. Her death had undone all that healing, sending him back into the darkness he'd thought escaped. But now, standing on the threshold of another battle, Elias realized something had changed. The darkness was still there, but it no longer consumed him. In its place was a fierce determination to protect what mattered: the town, its people, and most especially the green-eyed schoolteacher who had somehow breached the walls around his heart. The first shot came at 20 minutes past midnight, a single rifle crack from the north end of town that shattered the tense silence. It was answered immediately by a volley from the defenders positioned on the rooftops, and then the night erupted into chaos. Cole Garrett had divided his force as Elias predicted, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. 3 riders charged down the main street, firing indiscriminately at windows and doorways, while others circled to hit the flanks of the town's defenses. In the church basement, Clara heard the shooting begin and felt the women around her stiffen with fear and resolve. "Remember what Elias told us?" she said, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "Stay low. Shoot only when you have a clear target and aim for the center of the body, not the head." Martha Henley chambered around in her Winchester with practiced ease. "Never thought I'd be using this on anything but wolves and coyotes. But I reckon 2-legged predators need putting down just the same." The church had been deemed unlikely to draw immediate attention. There was nothing of value inside, and its stone construction made it a poor target for firebrands. But Elias had warned that if the battle went badly for the defenders, the outlaws might target it as a way to break the town's resolve. For nearly an hour, the fighting raged through Cedar Ridge without directly threatening the church. Clara and the other women could track the battle's progress by the shifting sounds of gunfire, sometimes concentrated in a furious exchange, sometimes scattered across town like deadly thunder. Then, just as it seemed the danger might pass them by, a shadow appeared at one of the basement windows, a man's face illuminated briefly by a flash of gunfire from the street. He disappeared only to return moments later with 2 companions. "They're trying to get in," Emily Patterson whispered, clutching her rifle with white-knuckled determination. Clara moved to the window, staying low as she'd been instructed. 3 of them. They're circling around to the back entrance." "Just like Elias said they might," Martha muttered. "Ladies, it seems our part in this drama has arrived. Remember your positions." They had prepared for this possibility, arranging the women in a defensive formation that covered both the stairs and the small rear door that led to the church garden. Clara took her place behind an overturned pew, her rifle braced against the solid wood. Around her, 8 other women did the same, while those with children retreated to the far corner of the basement. The attack came with surprising speed, the rear door splintering under a concentrated assault, followed by the rush of booted feet on the stone steps. The first outlaw burst into the basement, a revolver in each hand, clearly expecting to find helpless women watching in fear. Instead, he faced a coordinated volley from 9 rifles. Clara's shot was among them, the recoil jarring her shoulder, but her aim true. The outlaw went down without a sound, and for a moment time seemed to freeze as the reality of what she'd done washed over her. She had taken a human life, something that would have been unimaginable in her previous existence. But there was no time for reflection. 2 more men were already pushing through the doorway, firing wildly into the dim basement. Clara worked the lever of her rifle with mechanical precision, just as Martha had taught her, and fired again. Beside her, Emily Patterson proved that protecting one's child could transform even the gentlest soul into something fierce and uncompromising. Her shot caught the second outlaw in the chest, dropping him at the foot of the stairs. The third man, seeing his companions fall and facing determined resistance where he'd expected easy victims, turned to flee. Martha's Winchester spoke once more, and he stumbled, wounded but not stopped. He disappeared into the darkness of the garden, leaving a trail of blood on the stone steps. "Is everyone all right?" Clara called out, her voice sounding strange to her own ears, calmer than she felt, more authoritative than she'd known she could be. A chorus of affirmatives came back, though one of the younger women was weeping quietly, and Emily Patterson was staring at her rifle as if she'd never seen it before. "You did what you had to do," Clara told her, squeezing her shoulder gently. "We all did." Martha was already organizing the others to secure the broken door and reset their defensive positions. They'll think twice before trying that again, she said grimly. But we need to stay alert. The night's not over yet. Outside, the main battle was reaching its climax. Cole Garrett's carefully planned assault had devolved into a series of individual firefights as his men found themselves trapped between prepared positions and disciplined crossfire. The advantage of numbers meant nothing when those numbers were scattered and confused. Elias had positioned himself at the heart of the defense, moving between positions as the situation demanded rallying men when they faltered and directing fire where it was most needed. This was what he'd been trained for during 4 years of war, not just to fight but to lead others in fighting to make the split-second decisions that meant the difference between victory and defeat. When Cole himself appeared at the end of the main street, silhouetted against the flames of a burning wagon, Elias knew the moment of final reckoning had arrived. Everything that had happened, Sarah's death, his years of exile, his rescue of Clara, the acceptance of the sheriff's badge had led to this confrontation between two men who understood that some conflicts could only be resolved through violence. As he checked the loads in his Colt and loosened the hunting knife in its sheath, Elias McCord prepared to discover whether redemption was something that could be earned at gunpoint or whether some sins were too deep to be washed away by blood, no matter how righteously shed. The battle for Cedar Ridge was about to reach its conclusion, and with it, the question of whether love could triumph over violence or whether some fights were too important to be won without becoming the very thing you were fighting against. In the church basement, Clara whispered a prayer for the man who'd shown her that courage came in many forms, and that sometimes the gentlest souls carried the heaviest burdens. Above her, gunfire continued to echo through the night, marking time until dawn, revealed who had paid the ultimate price for the right to call Cedar Ridge home. Clara's dress was torn and stained with blood that wasn't her own, but she fought with the fierce determination of a mother protecting her cubs. The blue silk that had once marked her as a refined Eastern lady was now battle-scarred evidence of her transformation into something harder and more resolute. When the outlaws had breached the church, she'd discovered reserves of courage she'd never known existed. The rifle kicked against her shoulder like an angry mule, but her aim remained steady as she helped drive back men who'd never expected resistance from women and children. Patterson, take Emily and the baby to the back room, Clara called out as gunfire erupted again from the street above. The rest of you reload and check your ammunition. Martha Henley wiped blood from a cut on her forehead where splinters from a shattered pew had found their mark. Never thought I'd be fighting for my life in the Lord's house, she muttered, working fresh cartridges into her Winchester. I don't think the Lord minds given the circumstances, Clara replied, surprised by her own calm. 3 months ago, she'd been teaching children their letters. Tonight, she was commanding women in battle, and the transition felt as natural as breathing. Outside, the sound of gunfire was becoming more sporadic, but more intense, as if the battle was concentrating into fewer but deadlier confrontations. Through the broken church windows, Clara could see muzzle flashes painting the darkness in brief, violent bursts of light. A new sound reached them, the heavy thud of boots on the church steps, followed by Cole Garrett's voice cutting through the night like a rusty blade. Ladies, I know you're in there, and I know you've got ammunition, but you can't stay holed up forever. Come out peaceable, and maybe some of you live to see morning. Clara exchanged glances with Martha. Both women understanding that surrender meant death just delivered with more cruelty and less honor. The outlaws hadn't ridden hundreds of miles to take prisoners. They'd come to send a message written in blood and terror. What's your answer, school marm? Garrett called out. I know you're the one giving orders in there. Educated women always think they're smarter than everyone else. Instead of responding with words, Clara answered with her rifle sending a bullet through the broken window that splintered wood inches from Garrett's head. The outlaw leader's laughter echoed off the church walls, but there was less confidence in it than before. Have it your way, he snarled, but understand what happens next is on your head. The scent of smoke reached them moments later, acrid and alarming. Through the windows, Clara could see flames licking up the church walls where someone had thrown burning brands through the broken glass. They're trying to burn us out, Martha said grimly. Clara's mind raced, evaluating options that dwindled with each passing second. The church had only 2 exits, the main doors at the front and the small garden door at the back, both likely covered by gunmen waiting for desperate women to flee the flames. The north wall, she decided, pointing to the far side of the basement. It's built into the hillside. If we break through those windows, we might be able to get out that way without being seen. Martha nodded, already organizing the women. We'll need something to break the glass, and we'll have to move quickly before the smoke gets too thick." As they worked to create an escape route, smashing the small basement windows with the butts of their rifles, Claire felt a strange clarity descend over her thoughts. This moment of crisis had stripped away every pretense in social construction, leaving only the essential truth of who she was and what she was capable of becoming. The Clara Davenport, who had left Boston 3 months ago, would be unrecognizable to her now that woman had been defined by external expectations and social constraints. This Clara covered in soot and blood, leading women and children through flames toward an uncertain salvation, was defined solely by her choices and her courage. Meanwhile, in the street, the main battle was reaching its climax. Cole Garrett's carefully planned assault had devolved into a series of individual firefights as his men found themselves trapped between prepared positions and disciplined crossfire. The advantage of numbers meant nothing when those numbers were scattered and confused. Elias had positioned himself at the heart of the defense, moving between positions as the situation demanded, rallying men when they faltered and directing fire where it was most needed. This was what he'd been trained for during 4 years of war, not just to fight, but to lead others in fighting, to make the split-second decisions that meant the difference between victory and defeat. The smell of smoke reached him just as he finished reloading behind the overturned water trough that had served as his temporary cover. Looking up, he saw flames engulfing the church, orange tongues licking at the night sky with hungry intensity. "The church," Jim Henley shouted from his position at the general store. "Garrett's men are burning it." Elias felt a cold fury settle over him, the kind of killing rage that had carried him through the worst moments of the war. Clara and the other women were trapped in that burning building, faced with the choice between fire and bullets, both equally fatal. "Cover me," he told Doc Peterson, who had joined the fighting when the wounded became too numerous for his small hospital to handle. Then he sprinted across the open street toward the church, bullets whining around him as Cole Garrett's remaining men tried to cut him down. He burst through the church's main doors to find chaos. Smoke filled the sanctuary and flames were licking up the walls where someone had thrown burning brands through the windows. In the basement, he could hear Clara's voice calling out orders, still calm, despite the growing inferno around them. "Down here!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the smoke and confusion. Clara appeared at the basement entrance, her face streaked with soot but her eyes bright with determination. Behind her came Martha Henley and the other women carrying children and helping the wounded. "The back wall," Elias said quickly. "There's a door that leads to the cemetery. We can get you out, but we have to move now." As they began, the desperate evacuation, gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Cole Garrett had positioned his remaining men to catch them in a crossfire as they emerged from the burning church, turning their escape into another deadly trap. But Clara Davenport had learned something important during her months on the frontier. Sometimes survival required becoming someone you'd never expected to be. And tonight, surrounded by fire and violence, she was ready to become exactly that. Jake Garrett's silver spurs lay scattered in the dust beside his brother's body, their ornate Mexican designs catching the first rays of dawn, breaking over Cedar Ridge. The spurs had been a symbol of Cole Garrett's arrogance, stolen from a wealthy rancher in Colorado, and worn as trophies of his contempt for law and order. Now they were just metal in the dirt, marking the end of a reign of terror that had claimed too many lives. The final confrontation had come as the church burned behind them, casting dancing shadows across the cemetery, where generations of Cedar Ridge's dead lay in peaceful rows. Elias had emerged from the smoke carrying little Tommy Patterson, while Clara led the other women to safety among the weathered headstones. Cole Garrett had been waiting for them, positioned behind a marble monument with his rifle ready and murder in his eyes. The outlaw leader's face was streaked with soot and blood, his clothes torn from the night's fighting, but his aim remained steady as death itself. "End of the line, mountain man," Garrett called out, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who'd never lost a gunfight. "You've cost me everything, my brother, my men, my reputation. Time to pay the bill." Elias set Tommy Patterson gently behind a large headstone, then turned to face the man who had brought war to a peaceful town. His hand rested easy on his Colt, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who understood that this moment would define everything that came after. "Your brother chose his path," Elias replied calmly. "Same as you, same as me. Difference is, I'm walking away from this and you're not." The shot that followed came not from Garrett's rifle, but from Clara's position near the church wall. Her bullet struck the marble monument inches from Garrett's head, showering him with stone chips and destroying his concentration for the split second Elias needed. The mountain man's Colt cleared leather with the fluid motion of 15 years' practice, but Garrett was too faster than his brother had been, with the reflexes of a man who'd survived by being quicker than death itself. Both guns fired simultaneously, their reports echoing off the church walls and rolling across the cemetery like thunder. Garrett's bullet tugged at Elias's buckskin sleeve, drawing blood but missing anything vital. Elias's shot took the outlaw leader's center mass, the heavy .45 caliber slug, stopping him like he'd run into a stone wall. But Cole Garrett wasn't finished. Wounded and dying, he raised his rifle for one final shot, not at Elias but at Clara, seeking vengeance against the woman whose courage had helped destroy his gang. The hunting knife left Elias's hand in a smooth, practiced motion, its horn handle warm from his grip. The blade caught the morning light as it spun through the air, covering the 20 feet between them in less than a heartbeat. It struck Cole Garrett just below the sternum, angling upward with the force and precision of a man who'd learned to throw knives during long winter nights when ammunition was scarce and practice was survival. The outlaw leader's rifle discharged harmlessly into the sky as he toppled backward, his reign of terror ended by 6 inches of German steel. Silence settled over the cemetery, broken only by the crackling of flames from the church and the distant lowing of cattle disturbed by the night's violence. Clara emerged from her position near the wall, her rifle still ready, but her hands steady despite everything she'd witnessed and done. "Is it over?" Martha Henley asked, rising from behind a headstone with her Winchester cradled in her arms. Elias walked to where Cole Garrett lay still, retrieving his knife and checking for signs of life. Finding none, he straightened and surveyed the battlefield that Cedar Ridge had become. The saloon was riddled with bullet holes, the church was burning, and there were bodies in the street that would need burying come full daylight. "It's over," he confirmed, holstering his Colt with hands that didn't shake despite the violence they just dealt. Clara approached slowly, stepping carefully around the scattered debris of the night's fighting. Up close, she could see the exhaustion in Elias's eyes, the weight of command and violence that would never fully leave him. But there was something else there too, a peace that hadn't been present before, as if some long-carried burden had finally been set down. "The children," he asked, "all safe, scared but safe?" Clara looked around at the destruction, at the women emerging from hiding places with weapons still in their hands. "We're all different now, aren't we?" "Yes," Elias agreed, "but different doesn't mean broken. Sometimes it means stronger." As he spoke, Garrett stirred, not quite dead despite his mortal wounds. His eyes flickered open, focusing on Elias with a mixture of hatred and something that might have been respect. "McCord," he gasped, blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth. Knew it was you, the cavalry captain, the one they called the Ghost." Elias stiffened, his face suddenly unreadable. "Save your breath, Garrett, it's over." But the dying outlaw wasn't finished. "You don't remember me, do you? I was there. Wyoming Territory, 68. Your unit burned us out. All of us, even them that weren't fighting." Clara watched the color drain from Elias's face, his eyes suddenly distant, as if seeing something far beyond the cemetery and the dying man at his feet. "My sister was in that cabin." Garrett continued, each word costing him visibly. "Emma, just 17, wasn't even part of it, just visiting." A rattling cough shook him, bringing more blood to his lips. "Funny thing about revenge, takes a long time sometimes." "What's he talking about, Elias?" Clara asked quietly. But Elias seemed frozen, locked in some private horror that Garrett's words had unleashed. The outlaw gave one final ghastly smile. "Your wife, up in those mountains, Blizzard didn't kill her. We did. Set those fires north of your cabin. Knew you'd go check. Knew the storm was coming." His eyes glazed slightly. "An eye for an eye, Captain McCord. A sister for a sister." With those words, Cole Garrett died, his final revenge delivered not with bullets, but with a truth that struck deeper than any physical wound could reach. Elias stood motionless, his face a mask of shock and dawning comprehension. 7 years of grief and guilt, suddenly reframed by a revelation that changed everything he had believed about Sarah's death. It hadn't been an accident of nature, nor his failure to protect her. It had been deliberate, calculated vengeance for actions he'd taken during his military service. Elias, Clara touched his arm gently. What was he talking about? For a long moment, Elias didn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. After the war, I served with a special cavalry unit tasked with pacifying the territories, protecting settlers, maintaining order. At least that's what we told ourselves. He looked down at Garrett's body with an expression that mingled disgust and recognition. In '68, we were sent to deal with a band of outlaws operating near Medicine Bow. Former Confederates turned bandits preying on homesteaders and stagecoaches. He drew a deep breath. We tracked them to a settlement, a couple of cabins in a hidden valley. Orders were to eliminate the threat. No prisoners, no questions. And you followed those orders. Clara said not a question, but a statement of understanding. I was a good soldier. Elias replied, the words like ashes in his mouth. We surrounded the cabins at dawn, set fire to force them out, shot them as they ran. Military efficiency. His eyes met hers, filled with the weight of memory. Only afterward did we learn there were innocents there. Family members, women, a few children. Not outlaws at all, just collateral damage. He looked around at the burning church, the bodies scattered through Cedar Ridge's once peaceful streets. I left the cavalry after that. Couldn't stomach what we'd become, what I'd become. Met Sarah a year later, tried to build something clean and good with her. A bitter laugh escaped him. And all this time, I thought it was the mountains that took her from me. But it was my own past catching up. Clara's mind raced, absorbing this revelation about the quiet mountain man who had seemed so straightforward in his grief. There were layers to his pain. She hadn't imagined complexities to his isolation that went beyond the loss of a beloved wife. You couldn't have known, she said finally. About Sarah, about Garrett's connection to your past. You were doing what you believed was right. Was I? Elias looked at her with haunted eyes. Or was I just following orders, letting others think for me? There's blood on my hands, Clara, not just from today or from rescuing you. Old blood, innocent blood. Before she could respond, Doc Peterson approached his medical bag in hand, his face gray with exhaustion. Elias, we need you at the schoolhouse. Wounded men, decisions to be made. Elias nodded visibly, gathering himself, pushing the revelation aside to deal with the immediate needs of the living. But Clara could see the new weight that had settled on his shoulders, the knowledge that his wife's death hadn't been a tragic accident, but the consequence of his own actions years before. As they walked back toward town, leaving Cole Garrett's body to the breaking dawn, Clara realized that she had been granted a rare glimpse into the true nature of frontier justice. It wasn't the clean, righteous force portrayed in Eastern newspapers, but a complex web of violence and retribution, where today's hero might be tomorrow's villain depending on who was telling the story. And Elias McCord, the man she had come to admire and perhaps love, stood at the center of that complexity, both victim and perpetrator, both protector and destroyer. The question now was whether he could reconcile those opposing truths, or whether this final revelation would drive him back into the wilderness away from human connection and the possibility of redemption. In the schoolhouse turned hospital, the aftermath of battle presented itself in stark human terms. Wounded men lay on makeshift pallets, their groans mingling with the hurried instructions of Doc Peterson and his hastily assembled nurses. The smell of blood and antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a sharp contrast to the usual sense of chalk dust and children's lunchboxes. Clara moved among the wounded, offering water and comfort where medicine could do no more. She had no formal training as a nurse, but frontier necessity made healers of anyone with steady hands and a strong stomach. Martha Henley worked beside her, her practical efficiency extending naturally from running a household to tending the injured. Elias had taken charge of the town's security, organizing patrols to ensure no outlaws remained hidden in the surroundings. His face was a study in control emotions buried beneath the immediate needs of the community. Only Clara, who had witnessed his reaction to Garrett's revelation, could see the tension in his shoulders and the shadows behind his eyes. As the day progressed, Cedar Ridge began the slow process of recovery. Bodies were removed and prepared for burial, buildings assessed for damage, and a rough inventory taken of supplies that would be needed for rebuilding. The church was beyond saving, its blackened timbers still smoldering as evening approached, but most of the town had survived intact if scarred by bullet holes and bloodstains. Clara found herself drawn to the cemetery as twilight fell, seeking a moment of quiet reflection after the chaos of the day. The marble monument that had sheltered Cole Garrett now bore the scars of her bullet, a permanent reminder of her transformation from Boston schoolteacher to frontier survivor. She was not surprised when Elias joined her there, his footsteps almost silent on the grass between the graves. They stood together without speaking, watching as the first stars appeared in the eastern sky. "I keep thinking about what Garrett said," Clara ventured finally, "about Sarah's death being revenge for something that happened years ago." Elias nodded, his profile sharp against the deepening blue of the evening sky. "Been thinking about it too, wondering how many other ghosts are out there waiting to collect debts I didn't know I owed." "Do you believe him, that they deliberately set those fires to lure you away from Sarah during the blizzard?" "Yes." The word was flat, certain. The timing was always strange, a forest fire in weather cold enough to signal a coming storm. "I questioned it even then, but was so focused on stopping the flames from reaching the cabin that I didn't consider it might be intentional." He rubbed his face wearily. "7 years I've blamed myself for not being there when she needed me. Now I find out it was all arranged, a trap I walked right into." Clara turned to face him directly. "Does knowing change anything? Does it lessen your grief or your guilt?" He considered the question with the same thoughtfulness he brought to all things. "Changes everything, and nothing, I suppose. Sarah's still gone. I still wasn't there to protect her. But knowing it wasn't random chance, that someone planned it," his hand tightened on his belt near where his knife hung, "makes me wonder if I've been hiding these past years, not just grieving. Hiding from what I did, from what I was." He gestured toward the town, visible as scattered lights in the gathering darkness. "Today reminded me. The planning, the tactics, giving orders that send men toward danger. It all came back like I'd never left it behind." His eyes met hers, troubled and questioning. "What does that make me, Clara? A soldier who can't escape his training? A killer who's found justification for his skills?" Clara thought carefully before answering, understanding the importance of this moment. "It makes you human, Elias. Complex and flawed like all of us, capable of both destruction and protection." She placed her hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "The question isn't what you were, but what you choose to be now." He covered her hand with his own, the gesture conveying gratitude for her understanding. They stood that way for a long moment, connected in the quiet of the cemetery, surrounded by the tangible reminders of mortality. "I should check on the night patrols," Elias said, finally reluctant to break the moment, but aware of his responsibilities. "Try to get some rest, Clara. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." As he walked away, Clara remained among the graves, contemplating the day's revelations and the man at the center of them. Elias McCord was not the simple mountain recluse she had first imagined, nor was he merely a grieving widower seeking solitude. He was a man shaped by war and guilt, by love and loss, by choices that had rippled outward to affect lives he'd never known he touched. And she, Clara Davenport, was no longer the proper Boston lady who had arrived in Cedar Ridge 3 months ago. She had killed men today, had led women in battle, had faced death without flinching. The transformation both exhilarated and troubled her, raising questions about who she truly was beneath the layers of social conditioning and expectation. As she made her way back to town, Clara touched the empty place at her collar, where her grandmother's cameo had once rested. Its loss during her captivity had seemed significant at the time, the final severing of ties to her former life. Now she recognized it as merely symbolic. The real transformation had happened within in ways no physical object could represent or contain. The true question, she realized, was whether she and Elias could build something new from the broken pieces of their former selves, or whether the weight of the past would prove too heavy for even their combined strength to bear. 3 days after the battle, Cedar Ridge held a communal funeral for those who had fallen in its defense. 5 pine coffins stood in a row before freshly dug graves, the raw earth a stark reminder of the cost of survival on the frontier. Pastor Williams, his arm in a sling from a bullet wound, spoke words of comfort and resurrection, his voice carrying across the cemetery, where nearly every resident of the town and surrounding ranches had gathered. Clara stood among the mourners, dressed in her best black dress, salvaged from the small trunk that had survived the fire in her living quarters above the schoolhouse. Beside her, Martha Henley wept quietly for her husband's cousin, who had died defending the general store from the initial Garrett attack. Elias stood apart at the edge of the crowd, the sheriff's badge gleaming dully on his buckskin vest. He had spent the past 3 days organizing the town's recovery, arranging for repairs, sending to Cheyenne for supplies, and ensuring that no further threats lurked in the surrounding countryside. The work had kept him busy from dawn until well past dusk, leaving little time for private conversation or reflection. Clara had watched him with growing concern, noting the shadows beneath his eyes and the increased distance in his manner. Garrett's revelation about Sarah's death had reopened wounds that had never properly healed, leaving Elias in a state of barely controlled turmoil that he channeled into relentless activity. As the final prayers were offered and the coffins lowered into the waiting earth, Clara found herself studying the faces around her. These people had been strangers 3 months ago, figures in a landscape she was determined to document and understand. Now they were neighbors, comrades, fellow survivors of a trauma that had forever altered their shared history. Emily Patterson stood with her children, Tommy solemn in his Sunday best, the baby quiet in her arms. Doc Peterson, exhausted from days of treating the wounded, leaned heavily on his cane. Pastor Williams, despite his injury, offered personal words of comfort to each bereaved family. And everywhere Clara saw the signs of resilience, tears shed without shame, hands clasped in support, the quiet determination to continue building a community worth defending. After the service, as people began to disperse, Clara made her way toward Elias, who remained standing at a distance, watching the proceedings with unreadable eyes. "Will you walk with me?" she asked quietly. "There are things we should discuss." He nodded, falling into step beside her as they moved away from the cemetery toward the edge of town. They walked in silence until they reached the small creek that provided Cedar Ridge, with its water where a fallen log offered a natural seat with a view of the mountains beyond. "You haven't been sleeping," Clara observed as they sat, leaving a careful space between them. Elias gave a slight shrug. "Too much to do." "That's not why." She turned to face him directly. "What Garrett told you about Sarah, about your past, it's eating at you. You're running from it by working yourself to exhaustion." A flicker of irritation crossed his face, quickly suppressed. "You have a way of seeing through pretense, don't you? I've spent the past 3 months interviewing frontier women, learning to read what isn't said as much as what is." She smoothed her skirt, a gesture that reminded her of her Boston upbringing, despite everything that had changed. "The women here don't have the luxury of self-deception. They face reality directly, however harsh it might be." "And in what reality do you think I'm avoiding?" There was a challenge in his tone, a defensiveness that confirmed her suspicions. "That you're not the man you thought you were, neither the remorseful soldier who retreated to the mountains to escape his past, nor the failed protector who couldn't save his wife from nature's cruelty." She held his gaze steadily. "You're both more and less than the story you've told yourself these past 7 years." Elias was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the distant peaks where he had found both refuge and isolation. "When Sarah died," he said finally, "I had a purpose, a focus for my guilt. I should have been there. I should have protected her." The blame was clear and simple. His voice hardened. "Now I learn it wasn't just bad luck or my poor judgment. It was deliberate revenge for something I did years before, something I tried to put behind me." "Does knowing make her death more painful?" Clara asked gently. "Makes it more complicated. If what Garrett said is true, and I believe it is, then Sarah died not for anything she did, but because of who she married. Because of me." He picked up a small stone and tossed it into the creek, watching the ripples spread outward. "All these years in the mountains, I thought I was atoning for failing her. But what if the real sin was bringing her into my life in the first place? What if loving her was what killed her?" The raw pain in his voice touched Clara deeply. Here was the core of his struggle, not just grief or guilt, but the question of whether he had the right to love at all, given the danger his past might bring to those closest to him. "Elias," she said, choosing her words with care, "we can't know what might have happened if you'd made different choices. Perhaps Sarah would have died in that blizzard regardless. Perhaps she would have lived a long life with you in the mountains. The only certainty is that she chose you knowing who you were and what you'd done in the war." "She knew some of it," he conceded. "Not all. There were things I couldn't bring myself to tell her. Like the raid Garrett mentioned. The cabins you burned." Elias nodded, his expression grim. "That and other things. The war didn't end cleanly for some of us. The fighting in the territories went on against Indians, outlaws, anyone who threatened the government's vision of order. He looked down at his hands, strong and capable hands that had both taken and preserved life. I followed orders without questioning them, believed I was on the right side until I couldn't ignore the evidence anymore. Clara considered this, thinking about her own journey from Boston propriety to frontier pragmatism. We all have parts of our past we'd rather forget, Elias. Choices we regret, moments when we failed to be the person we aspired to be. Not like this, he insisted. Not with blood on your hands. Are you so sure? She met his surprised glance with a steady gaze. 3 days ago, I shot a man in the church basement. I watched him die and felt relief, not horror, not revulsion, but relief that it was him and not me or the children I was protecting. She swallowed hard. What does that make me, Elias, a killer? A survivor, both. He studied her face, seeing not judgment, but genuine understanding. Both, I suppose. That's the reality of the frontier. Sometimes survival requires actions that would be unthinkable in more civilized settings. Then perhaps we're not so different, you and I. Clara reached across the space between them and took his hand. Your past is part of you, Elias. It shaped you into the man who saved this town, who risked everything to rescue me from Devil's Canyon. If there's blood on your hands from long ago, there's also the life you've preserved more recently. Elias looked down at their joined hands, his larger one enveloping hers. What are you saying, Clara? I'm saying that redemption isn't found in isolation or self-punishment. It's found in the choices we make each day to be better than we were, to use whatever skills we have, even those learned in violence, for protection rather than destruction. She tightened her grip on his hand. And I'm saying that Sarah's death wasn't your fault, whether it was random chance or calculated revenge. The blame lies with those who made the choice to harm her, not with you for having loved her. The tension in Elias's shoulders eased slightly, as if a burden he'd carried for 7 years had shifted, not disappeared, but become more bearable. You have a way of cutting through to the heart of things, he said, a hint of his rare smile touching his lips. It's the teacher in me, Clara replied, returning the smile. We're trained to see past excuses to the real issue at hand. They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching the creek flow steadily toward the distant river, carrying fallen leaves and small branches in its current. There was comfort in the water's constancy and the reminder that nature continued its cycles regardless of human joy or suffering. There's something I need to tell you, Clara said finally, knowing that if she expected honesty from Elias, she must offer the same. Something about why I really came west. Elias turned to her, curiosity replacing the shadows in his eyes. I thought you came to teach, to escape expectations that weren't your own. That's part of it, but not all. She withdrew her hand from his and clasped both of hers in her lap, a gesture that betrayed her nervousness. I was engaged to be married in Boston, as I told you. Charles Thornton, son of a prominent banker, a perfect match by every social measure. She paused, gathering courage for the confession. What I didn't say was that I broke the engagement under difficult circumstances. Charles was controlling, possessive, Isham. When I expressed interest in writing and having a voice beyond our home, he became angry. One night after a particularly heated argument, he struck me. Elias's expression darkened, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. I defended myself, Clara said, her voice steady despite the painful memory. There was a letter opener on the desk beside me. I grabbed it without thinking, and she closed her eyes briefly. I wounded him. Not severely, but enough to draw blood and create a scandal. His family hushed it up, but my reputation was ruined. No respectable man in Boston would consider me after that. So I came west, not just seeking freedom from expectation, but escaping the consequences of my actions. She looked at Elias directly, needing to see his reaction. I've been interviewing the women here for a book I hope to write someday about female experience on the frontier, the strength and resilience I've witnessed. But I'm also seeking something for myself, a place where I might be judged by who I am, rather than by Boston gossip and social rules I never fully embraced. Elias was quiet for a moment, absorbing her revelation. Then, to Clara's surprise, he laughed softly. We're quite a pair, aren't we? Both running from pasts that don't quite fit the people we've become. The acceptance in his voice released a tension Clara hadn't realized she was carrying. You're not Disappointed, many would consider what I did unforgivable, a woman raising her hand against her fiancé, creating a public scandal. Clara, Elias said gently, I've seen you face down armed outlaws to protect your students. I've watched you lead women in battle and comfort the wounded afterward. Your courage and compassion define you far more than any Boston scandal. He reached out to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender. Besides, I'm hardly in a position to judge someone for defending themselves when threatened. The understanding between them deepened in that moment, built on shared confidences and mutual acceptance of the complexities that made them who they were. Clara leaned slightly into his touch, allowing herself to acknowledge the feelings that had been growing since that first impulsive kiss during the bank robbery. What happens now? She asked, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. With the town, with the badge you're wearing, with... She hesitated. With us, Elias withdrew his hand slowly, thoughtfully. The federal marshals should arrive tomorrow or the next day. They'll want statements about what happened here, details about the Garrett gang for their records. He looked toward the town, its windows beginning to glow with lamplight as evening settled. As for the badge, I'm not sure. Never saw myself as a lawman, but the town needs stability while it rebuilds. And us, Clara pressed, unwilling to let the most important question go unanswered. He met her gaze directly, his gray eyes serious. That depends on what you want, Clara. I'm not the man who kissed you during the bank robbery anymore. That was an impulse desperation. And I'm not just the grieving widower who retreated to the mountains either. He drew a deep breath. I'm someone in between, still figuring out who I can be now that old wounds have been reopened and old lies exposed. I'm not the same either, Clara admitted. The proper Boston lady has gone replaced by someone who's fired a rifle in defense of her life and led other women to do the same. Someone who's seen violence and participated in it. She reached for his hand again, needing the connection. But I think that's the point, Elias. We're both becoming something new. Perhaps we could discover what that is, together. The word hung between them, full of promise and uncertainty. Elias looked down at their joined hands and back to her face, his expression softening. Together, he repeated, testing the sound of it. Been a long time since that word meant anything to me. It could, again, Clara said simply, if you're willing to tree. Instead of answering with words, Elias leaned forward and kissed her, not the desperate, impulsive kiss of their first encounter, but something gentler and more deliberate. A kiss that spoke of choice rather than chance, of possibility rather than mere survival. When they parted, the first stars were appearing in the eastern sky, bright points of light against the deepening blue. They sat together a while longer, not speaking, but comfortable in the silence, watching night claim the landscape they both had come to call home. The wedding quilt spread across Clara and Elias's marriage bed was a masterpiece of frontier craftsmanship sewn by the women of Cedar Ridge during the long winter months that followed the battle. Each square told a story. Martha Henley's contribution featured a schoolhouse surrounded by children's handprints, while Emily Patterson had embroidered a mountain scene that captured the view from Elias's old cabin. Clara traced the intricate stitching with gentle fingers, marveling at how something so beautiful could emerge from hands that had held rifles just 3 months before. The quilt represented more than a wedding gift. It was the community's way of saying that love and creation could triumph over violence and destruction, that people who'd fought together could also build together. Outside their window, the rebuilt church bells rang the hour, their bronze voices carrying across a town that looked much the same as before but felt fundamentally different. The new church was larger than the old one, with stone walls and stained glass windows donated by grateful ranchers whose cattle had been saved from the Garrett gang's depredations. More importantly, it had been built by people who understood the value of what they were creating. Hard to believe it's been 3 months, Elias said, adjusting the sheriff's badge on his vest. The star had taken on a comfortable weight during the winter, becoming less a burden and more a natural part of who he was becoming. Harder to believe how much has changed, Clara replied, smoothing her simple wedding dress. She'd chosen blue wool instead of white silk, practical rather than ornate, suitable for a woman who planned to spend her life on the frontier rather than in drawing rooms. The changes went deeper than clothing and buildings. Clara's students had returned to school in November, but they were different children than the ones who'd fled in September. They'd seen their mothers fight and their fathers die, had learned that safety was something that had to be earned rather than assumed. But they'd also learned that courage was contagious, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when the situation demanded it. Little Sarah Wickham still treasured the wooden horse Elias had carved, but now she also knew how to load a rifle and had watched her mother use one to defend their home. Tommy Patterson spoke with quiet pride about his father's service in the town's defense, while Mary Wickham had taken up the serious study of medicine under Doc Peterson's tutelage. "You've taught them well," Elias observed, watching Clara arrange the last of her belongings in their shared dresser. "They're growing up to be the kind of people this country needs." "We all are," Clara replied. "Growing up, I mean, learning what we're capable of when everything we care about is at risk." The wedding ceremony had been simple, conducted by Pastor Williams in the new church before the entire population of Cedar Ridge and half the surrounding territory. Clara had walked down the aisle alone, having no family present to give her away. But she'd felt supported by every person in the congregation, people who'd fought beside her and survived horrors that would have broken weaker souls. Elias had worn his best clothes, but kept the sheriff's badge in place, a reminder that their love had been forged in service to something larger than themselves. When they exchanged vows, the words carried weight that went beyond the traditional promises of marriage. They were pledging to build something together in a place where building required constant courage. Sheriff Tom Bradley recovered from his wounds, but walking with a cane had performed the honor of pronouncing them husband and wife. The old lawman's eyes had been bright with tears as he watched the badge he'd worn for 15 years find its worthy successor. "Never seen two people more meant for each other," he'd whispered to Doc Peterson during the reception, "like they were made from the same piece of mountain stone." Now, as evening settled over their wedding date, Clara and Elias stood together at the window of their small house, the former teacher's quarters expanded and improved by willing hands. The view encompassed the entire town, from the rebuilt church to the new schoolhouse, from the general store to the sheriff's office where Elias would report for duty tomorrow morning. "Any regrets?" Elias asked, slipping his arms around his wife's waist. "About leaving Boston, about coming west, about marrying a man who forgot what women smelled like." Clara leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid strength that had first attracted and now comforted her. "Not a single one. Even though life here will never be easy, even though there'll always be dangers we can't predict or control." Clara turned in his arms, studying the face that had become as familiar as her own reflection. The lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting against mountain snow and desert sun, while the scar on his jaw marked some long-ago encounter with violence. But there was peace in those gray eyes now, the kind of contentment that came from finding purpose beyond mere survival. "Especially because of those things," she said firmly. "Easy lives don't teach you what you're made of. They don't show you what you're capable of becoming." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of children's laughter drifted through the window. A group of Clara's students were playing in the street, their voices bright with the kind of joy that could only exist in places where safety had been earned rather than inherited. "Listen to that," Clara said softly. 3 months ago, those children were learning to hide from gunfire. Tonight, they're playing games in the street because they know we'll protect them." "We," Elias repeated, tasting the word like fine wine. "I like the sound of that." They stood together as darkness fell over Cedar Ridge, watching lamplight bloom in windows throughout the town. Each light represented a family that had chosen to stay, to rebuild, to trust in a future that required constant tending, but promised rewards that couldn't be measured in comfort or convenience. In the distance, the mountains rose like ancient guardians against the star-filled sky. Somewhere among those peaks lay the cabin where Elias had spent 10 years learning to live with grief. But that life seemed as distant now as Clara's existence in Boston, a necessary chapter in a story that had led them both to this moment, this place, this understanding of what love could become when it chose to serve something larger than itself. On Clara's writing desk lay her journal, its pages filled with the stories of the women she had interviewed throughout the fall and winter. The book was taking shape not as the academic study she had initially envisioned, but as a testament to female courage and resilience on the frontier. She had added her own story to the collection, recording honestly the transformation from refined Boston schoolteacher to frontier survivor. Beside the journal lay her grandmother's cameo brooch, recovered from Devil's Canyon during a journey Elias had made alone one cold November day. He'd returned it to her without fanfare, simply placing the ivory piece in her palm with a quiet, "Thought you might want this back." The gesture had moved her deeply, not just for the recovered heirloom, but for what it represented: his understanding of connections to the past, even as they built a future together. Clara wore the brooch now pinned to her wedding dress as a bridge between who she had been and who she had become. Some traditions were worth preserving, some connections worth maintaining, even as new ones formed in this harsh, beautiful land. "What are you thinking?" Elias asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "About journeys," Clara replied. "How they rarely lead where we expect them to. How sometimes the greatest discoveries come from wrong turns and unexpected detours." Elias nodded, understanding, without need for elaboration. His own journey had taken him from battlefield to mountain solitude to sheriff's badge, a path no one could have predicted, least of all himself. "Reminds me of tracking in new country," he said. "You follow the signs as best you can, but sometimes the trail leads places you never intended to go. And sometimes," Clara added, turning in his arms to face him, "those unintended destinations turn out to be exactly where you needed to be all along." The simple truth of her words settled between them, a foundation as solid as the stone walls of the new church or the timber frame of their shared home. They had both traveled long roads marked by loss and discovery, by violence and healing, to find each other in this remote corner of Wyoming territory. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, disputes to settle, lessons to teach, the constant work of building a community worthy of the sacrifices made to defend it. But tonight they had each other, the quiet certainty of belonging that neither had expected to find again. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft flakes drifting past their window in a gentle reminder of winter's approach. But unlike the blizzard that had claimed Sarah's life 7 years ago, this snow brought no fear, only the peaceful knowledge that they faced the seasons together, stronger for having weathered storms, both natural and human. Elias drew Clara closer, his arms secure around her waist. "Mrs. McCord," he said, the new name still a wonder on his lips. "Sheriff McCord," she replied, smiling up at him. In that moment, all the complexities of their pasts, his guilt and her rebellion, his violence and her ambition, seemed to recede, leaving only the simple truth of two people who had found in each other not just love, but understanding. As night deepened over Cedar Ridge, they turned from the window toward their shared future, carrying with them the lessons of survival and the promise of something richer than mere existence. They had come to the frontier seeking different forms of escape, but had found instead a purpose worthy of their courage and a love equal to their strength. And that, Clara thought as Elias's lips found hers in the gentle darkness, was a story worth recording, a truth worth preserving, for those who might someday wonder what it meant to build a life on the very edge of civilization, where danger and beauty, hardship and reward existed in perfect necessary balance. The end.